Tommy Lascelles did not begin distrusting Edward because of Wallis Simpson. He began years earlier, when the prince was still the most admired young man in the British Empire. In the autumn of 1920, Alan Lascelles came home from India with a new wife, a respectable name, a soldier's reputation, and no obvious reason to place himself inside another man's household. He was 33, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, and already known as Tommy to almost everyone who mattered. He had been born into the sort of family that understood the monarchy without needing it explained. His grandfather had been the 4th Earl of Harewood. His relatives moved through country houses where dukes arrived late, bishops stayed for tea, and everyone knew which chair belonged to whom. This was not the same as being rich beyond anxiety. The British upper class contained many people with large dining rooms and surprisingly delicate bank accounts. What Lascelles inherited was not a fortune so much as a code. A gentleman served. A gentleman kept his word. A gentleman did not make other people clean up a mess he had created for amusement. These rules were not always obeyed by the people who praised them most, but Lascelles took them seriously. He had studied classics at Oxford, gone through the First World War, served in France with the Bedfordshire Yeomanry, and won the Military Cross. The war did not make him sentimental about uniforms. He had seen what duty cost when there were no photographers present. That mattered later, because Edward loved the appearance of service, and Lascelles had learned to look for the part that happened after the cheering stopped. After the war, Lascelles went to Bombay as an aide to his brother-in-law, Lord Lloyd, the governor. India gave him work, heat, danger, ceremony, and Joan Thesiger, the daughter of the viceroy. They met during a gathering connected with an elephant roundup in Mysore. Joan was younger, capable, and sufficiently calm around rifles to shoot a tigress cleanly. Lascelles was impressed. In his world, romance rarely arrived without a house party and some form of animal being pursued. They married in March 1920. By the time they returned to England, Lascelles had a wife to support and a future to choose. Then a friend brought him a letter. The household of the Prince of Wales was looking for an assistant private secretary. The offer carried glamour, access, and a reasonable income. It also carried proximity to the man who would one day be king. For a young courtier, it was the sort of position that could become a life's work. The prince was 26, unmarried, handsome, and internationally famous. Crowds broke through barriers to see him. Newspapers followed his clothes, his horses, his dances, and his smile. In Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Caribbean, and the United States, he had been received not merely as royalty, but as a kind of living reassurance that the old world had survived the war and had somehow become young again. Edward seemed modern without appearing dangerous. He shook hands freely. He laughed in public. He looked slim in uniform. He could speak to veterans without sounding as though he had been sent a paragraph by a committee. To millions of people, he was the prince who understood them. Lascelles accepted the job. It is possible that he already knew the public picture was incomplete. Everyone near the royal family knew that the Prince of Wales was emotional, restless, and less disciplined than his father. But private flaws were not unusual in royal households. A prince could be impatient, vain, or fond of unsuitable company, and still grow into duty. The institution had survived worse. It had survived uncles. What Lascelles could not know was how quickly he would stop seeing Edward's weaknesses as temporary habits and begin seeing them as the centre of his character. The work itself was not decorative. A private secretary's office turned royal personality into public action. Invitations had to be judged, speeches had to be prepared. Ministers expected replies, governors requested visits, regiments wanted anniversaries remembered, charities hoped for patronage, bereaved families wrote asking for comfort, ambitious people wrote asking for almost everything else. The prince's name sat at the top of this mountain of expectation. Men like Lascelles were underneath it with paper, ink, and increasingly firm expressions. At first, Edward could be dazzling. He remembered faces. He had an instinctive sympathy for wounded soldiers and unemployed men. He was willing to enter factories, mines, hospitals, and poor districts that many fashionable people preferred to discuss from a comfortable distance. He disliked stiffness, and because the court of George V contained enough stiffness to preserve several small nations, This seemed refreshing. Lascelles was not blind to Edward's gifts. That is important. Distrust grows differently when it begins in admiration. A man who is obviously useless is easy to manage. A man who can be excellent for an hour and irresponsible for the next 23 is far more dangerous. He persuades everyone that the better version is the real one and the worse version is merely tired. Edward understood crowds because crowds asked almost nothing personal of him. They wanted a wave, a smile, a few words, perhaps the impression that he had looked directly at them. He could give that generously. The trouble began when duty became private, repetitive, or inconvenient. Letters bored him. Preparation irritated him. Advice sounded to him like control. A schedule was an enemy written in neat handwriting. Lascelles began to see that Edward's charm did not always lead to gratitude. It often led to entitlement. The prince was loved, therefore the prince expected to be indulged. If he was indulged, he was delightful. If he was resisted, even over something small, the temperature changed. This was not yet a constitutional crisis. It was a household problem. But monarchies often reveal their future in household problems. Edward had grown up as David inside the family, the eldest son of King George V and Queen Mary. His father believed in punctuality, correct dress, naval discipline, and the healing effect of being told to try harder. His mother believed in duty with a concentration that made duty seem almost restful. Their eldest son was sensitive, nervous, and desperate for affection. He wanted warmth from parents who loved him but belonged to a generation that often delivered love through rules, inspections, and carefully selected birthday gifts. He learned early that charm could open doors that complaint could not. He also learned that being the heir made adults forgive him. The two lessons joined together. Edward could be genuinely kind, then genuinely selfish, without feeling much contradiction between the two. The First World War enlarged his public standing. He wanted active service and was not permitted to risk capture at the front. He visited the trenches and came close enough to danger to earn respect, though never close enough to satisfy his own need to prove himself. Soldiers liked him. He was young, informal, and visibly uncomfortable with ceremony. After 4 years of slaughter, a prince who seemed embarrassed by grandeur had obvious appeal. Yet the war also left Edward with a powerful appetite for escape. He danced, drank, rode, travelled, and attached himself to women who offered the emotional reassurance he did not find at home. By the time Lascelles entered his service, the central woman in Edward's private life was Frida Dudley Ward. Frida was married, beautiful, socially skilled, and older in the ways that mattered. She soothed him. He wrote to her constantly, often in the language of a much younger man. Their affair was not a passing indiscretion hidden between engagements. It became an emotional system around which Edward arranged his days. Lascelles did not object simply because Frida was married. He was a courtier, not a village magistrate. Royal households had long histories of mistresses, discreet arrangements, and marriages that functioned with the assistance of tact. The problem was not that Edward had a private life. The problem was that he allowed private need to command public time. Telephone calls, letters, changes of plan, sudden moods, and urgent efforts to remain in contact could pull the prince away from work. Edward's dependence made him less predictable. If Frida reassured him, he could be buoyant. If he felt neglected, he could become agitated and self-absorbed. The future king of a global empire could be emotionally overturned by a delayed reply. To Lascelles, this was not romantic. It was alarming. He had married a woman he loved, but love in his mind did not cancel obligation. It made obligation more serious. Edward seemed to use love as permission to abandon whatever stood outside it. That difference between them would widen over the years, until they could barely look at the same action and agree on what it meant. The prince also surrounded himself with companions who made resistance less likely. Some were loyal and decent. Others were amusing men whose chief qualification was their ability to keep the evening moving. Edward liked people who did not lecture him. Unfortunately, the heir to the throne was one of the few men in Britain who occasionally required a lecture and was least likely to receive an honest one. A royal friend could enjoy cars, horses, nightclubs, country weekends, and the reflected glow of the prince's attention. A royal secretary enjoyed none of the reflected glow and received the bills, complaints, rearranged appointments, offended officials, and urgent messages. One group saw spontaneity, the other saw paperwork with a pulse. Lascelles was not naturally forgiving of foolishness. He could be severe, proud, and certain of his own judgment. He had the confidence of a man raised among powerful people who had also survived being shot at. He was not intimidated by a title, even when he served it. This made him useful to Edward, and almost guaranteed that the two men would eventually collide. For the moment, the prince's public triumphs concealed the private strain. The British Empire was still vast, though the war had weakened its money, confidence, and authority. Royal tours were expected to hold distant territories close through ceremony and affection. Edward was the ideal figure for this work. He looked like the future and travelled as the son of tradition. In October 1921, he left Portsmouth aboard the battlecruiser Renown for an 8-month journey through India, Ceylon, Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, and other stops. The tour would cover roughly 41,000 miles. It was a tremendous production of uniforms, receptions, trains, banquets, speeches, and military inspections, garlands, gun salutes, and polite exhaustion. Lascelles went with him. India was already familiar to Lascelles. He knew its scale, its princely courts, its British officials, and the dangerous habit of mistaking ceremony for consent. The tour arrived at a moment of intense political strain. Mahatma Gandhi's non-cooperation movement was urging Indians to boycott British institutions and foreign goods. The visit of the Prince of Wales, intended as a display of imperial unity, became an obvious target. When Edward landed in Bombay in November, the official welcome was magnificent. Streets had been prepared, loyal communities turned out, dignitaries assembled in formal dress under a hot sky. But beyond the arranged route, much of the city observed a strike. Shops were closed. Nationalists stayed away. Violence broke out between groups supporting and opposing the boycott. People were killed. Hundreds were injured. Cars and shops burned while the royal program continued under layers of protection and ceremony. Edward was not personally responsible for the politics that greeted him. He was 27 and had been sent to perform a role designed by older men. He could not negotiate with Gandhi, rewrite British policy, or repair the wounds of empire by smiling from a carriage. Lascelles understood that. He also watched how the prince responded when the world refused to behave like an admiring crowd. Edward could be distressed by suffering. He was not without feeling. But feeling in him often became a demand that the unpleasant thing be moved away. He wanted the tour to succeed because failure wounded him personally. He did not always separate the pain of the people outside from the humiliation of being rejected by them. This distinction mattered to Lascelles. A sovereign had to absorb insult without turning government into a defense of his emotions. A king would be criticized, caricatured, opposed, and sometimes hated by people he would never meet. If Edward treated disapproval as betrayal, he would either retreat from duty or try to bend duty around himself. The tour continued. There were palaces lit for banquets, railway platforms crowded with officials, soldiers standing in straight lines, princes offering jewels and hospitality, and endless moments in which Edward had to look interested in a speech he had not written about a subject he had barely been briefed to understand. He did many of these things well. That was the maddening part. He could step from a train after little sleep and transform himself before the public. He could make a veteran feel seen. He could charm a ruler, delight a child, and rescue a dull ceremony with one unplanned remark. Lascelles watched audiences soften toward him. Then, behind closed doors, the prince might complain about the schedule, neglect papers, resent advice, or fix his attention on polo and private messages. The contrast sharpened Lascelles' suspicion. Edward did not lack the ability to do his duty. He lacked the willingness to let duty govern him when applause was absent. There were moments of real fatigue. The schedule would have tested a stronger man. The prince had already been worn down by previous tours. Days began early and ended late. Heat, formal clothing, travel, crowds, speeches, and constant observation created a life in which even breakfast could become an imperial event. Lascelles could sympathize with exhaustion. He could not sympathize with turning exhaustion into a permanent exemption from discipline. In India, Edward also found companionship in men who shared his love of horses and escape. One of them was Edward Dudley Metcalfe, known as Fruity. Metcalfe was cheerful, reckless, and deeply appealing to a prince who disliked solemn people. He knew horses, enjoyed late nights, and did not burden a room with caution. Edward took to him quickly. Lascelles saw the danger just as quickly. Fruity was not wicked. Wickedness would have been easier. He was irresponsible in an entertaining way, which is one of the most durable forms of influence. He helped make Edward feel that anyone who objected to pleasure was tedious, and anyone who warned him was disloyal. Around such friends, restraint became a personality defect. A prince does not need every companion to be wise. He does need at least one person in the room who can say that an idea is foolish before it becomes tomorrow's problem. Edward increasingly preferred rooms where that person had not been invited. The strain between prince and secretary remained mostly invisible. Lascelles did not challenge him over every small failure. A courtier who objected to everything would soon be ignored about anything. He watched, recorded, and learned where the prince's attention went when no one could reward him for it. He noticed Edward's hunger to be liked. He noticed how quickly affection became possession. He noticed that the prince wanted the freedom of an ordinary man while retaining the obedience owed to an extraordinary one. He wanted friends to treat him casually and servants to respond instantly. He wanted to escape ceremony, yet expected every escape to be arranged with royal efficiency. There was something almost boyish in it, and many people found that boyishness endearing. Lascelles found it less charming because he could see the machinery required to protect it. Every change of plan had a cost. Trains waited. Hosts rearranged meals. Officials abandoned families to solve avoidable problems. Staff worked late. Messages crossed continents. Money was spent to preserve the illusion that the prince had simply followed an impulse. Spontaneity is one of the most expensive luxuries available to a royal household. Edward rarely saw the full cost because other people carried it. This was the seed of Lascelles' deepest objection. The prince did not merely behave badly from time to time. He seemed unable or unwilling to imagine the burden his behavior placed on people whose names would never appear in the newspapers. For Lascelles, character was revealed in those invisible debts. A man could be charming to a crowd because the crowd was watching. The test came in how he treated the secretary who brought an unwelcome paper, the official who asked him to keep a promise, the servant who had been awake since dawn, or the wife waiting while her husband repaired another royal evening. Joan Lascelles was at home with a young marriage that had almost immediately been asked to make room for the Prince of Wales. Royal service sounded grand from the outside. From inside it meant absence. Tommy travelled when Edward travelled, waited when Edward delayed, and returned carrying thoughts he could not repeat freely. Joan had married a man and acquired a future king as an uninvited third presence. Lascelles accepted sacrifice when it served something larger. He had done that in war. What angered him was sacrifice demanded by another man's appetite, and then renamed service. Still, he remained at his post. He was not yet ready to conclude that Edward was beyond repair. The prince was young. Kingship was distant. Experience might sober him. Marriage might steady him. His father's example might finally take hold. Many difficult heirs had become serious sovereigns once the crown touched their heads. But hope was already becoming an argument Lascelles had to make against the evidence of his own eyes. As the journey moved across India, the public photographs showed a slim prince among elephants, soldiers, maharajas, crowds, and ceremonial archers. They preserved confidence. They did not show the private office measuring each day's damage, or the courtier beginning to understand that Edward's greatest talent was not duty itself. It was making duty look effortless while everyone around him paid for the effort. Then the ship turned east toward Japan, and Lascelles discovered that distance from England did not make the problem smaller. It merely removed the witnesses. Japan received Edward with a discipline that made even the British court look relaxed. When the renown reached Yokohama in April 1922, the welcome had been prepared with almost theatrical care. Flags crossed the streets, crowds gathered beneath arches, officials measured each movement. The prince, who had spent months slipping between ceremony and resistance, now entered a country where ceremony was not an interruption to life. It was one of the ways life was arranged. The reigning emperor Taisho was in poor health, so Crown Prince Hirohito took the leading role in receiving him. The two young heirs were close in age, but they had been formed by very different expectations. Hirohito appeared controlled, watchful, and contained. Edward was quick, restless, and eager to turn formality into personal warmth. Photographs showed them together as symbols of two old monarchies adapting to a changed world. Lascelles saw something less convenient. One heir understood that the performance belonged to the office. The other seemed to believe the office should adjust itself to his mood. Edward enjoyed Japan. He visited shrines, attended an imperial banquet, watched displays of sport, and allowed himself to be photographed in Japanese dress. He could be genuinely curious when something caught his imagination. He was not merely pretending his way through every encounter. He admired beauty, enjoyed novelty, and responded warmly to people who treated him without the frozen deference he associated with his father. That made him especially effective abroad. Foreign hosts did not have to manage him for years. They saw him for days. He arrived, smiled, broke a small rule, delighted everyone, and moved on before the consequences required a committee. Lascelles remained after the delight had passed. He watched the staff gather papers, restore schedules, and correct misunderstandings. He saw how easily Edward confused an ability to escape stiffness with an ability to govern himself. The prince could loosen a room. He could not always tighten his own conduct. The 4 weeks in Japan brought more crowds, more banquets, and more evidence of his unusual public gift. At Yokohama, Edward unveiled a memorial to the Allied dead. In Tokyo, the streets filled for him. At official events, he seemed to embody youth without disrespect, royalty without coldness. Britain wanted precisely this image. After war, revolution, and the collapse of several European thrones, the monarchy needed a future that did not look frightened of ordinary people. Edward supplied that future beautifully. Lascelles was beginning to fear that it existed only in public. The renown carried them home through the spring. By June, Edward had completed another immense journey and returned to a country ready to praise his endurance. Newspapers described the miles, the welcomes, the loyalty, and the prince who had carried British goodwill across Asia. They did not describe the private strain. The press of the period generally protected the royal family from intimate scandal. Editors knew far more than they printed. A married mistress, emotional storms, careless companions, and household quarrels could remain safely behind a curtain of respect. That curtain protected the crown. It also protected Edward from learning what public judgment felt like. At home, his reputation grew faster than his discipline. He was now the most marketable member of the family, though no one at the palace would have used such a commercial word. His face sold newspapers. His clothes were copied. His arrival could turn a civic opening into a national event. Town councils competed for visits. Charities wanted his name. Veterans trusted his sympathy. Young women saw romance. Older women saw the son they wished the war had returned to them. George V saw something else. He saw an unmarried heir moving into his late 20s with no serious plan to provide the next generation. For the king, marriage was not an emotional adventure. It was part of the national equipment. The Prince of Wales needed a suitable wife, children, and a household that did not depend on the availability of the wife of another man. Queen Mary worried too, though she understood her eldest son differently. She knew that David, as the family called him, craved affection. She also knew that craving did not make every attachment wise. She could be patient with his nerves and still disapprove of his conduct. Her manner was formal, but her intelligence was practical. A future queen could not be selected merely because David found her soothing after dinner. Possible brides existed. Royal and aristocratic Europe still contained daughters with impeccable ancestry, good manners, and mothers prepared to study the British succession as though it were a promising railway investment. Yet Edward showed little appetite for the arrangement. He wanted love without surrendering freedom, domestic tenderness without domestic duty, and loyalty from women whose existing marriages kept them from making the final demand. Freda Dudley Ward suited this contradiction. She had her own house, her own children, her own husband, and enough social sense to understand the rules. She did not publicly press Edward toward marriage. She gave him intimacy while leaving the central structure of his life unchanged. To a man terrified of being trapped, this felt like safety. To Lascelles, it looked like delay disguised as devotion. The office had to work around the relationship. Letters traveled constantly. Telephone calls took priority. Plans could be influenced by where Freda might be or when Edward expected to hear from her. He wrote with an intensity that belonged less to a confident future king than to a lonely young man afraid that affection could vanish while he was at lunch. Lascelles could pity that loneliness. He could not allow pity to erase the danger. Edward was being trained by his own household to believe that his emotional state was a matter of national importance. When he was distressed, everyone adjusted. When he was bored, the schedule bent. When he was pleased, the day became easy and people called him wonderful. This is not an ideal education for constitutional restraint. The difference between Edward and his younger brother became harder to ignore. Prince Albert, known in the family as Bertie, was shy, hesitant in speech, and uncomfortable before crowds. He lacked the easy radiance that made Edward seem born for public life. But Bertie worked. He prepared. He married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in April 1923, after she had twice hesitated before accepting him. Their marriage was warm, steady, and unusually affectionate by royal standards. Edward loved his brother, but Bertie choosing marriage exposed what Edward continued to avoid. The younger son had accepted limitation and found happiness inside it. The elder son treated limitation as an insult. The wedding brought the family a popular new duchess and gave George V a measure of relief. Bertie and Elizabeth looked dependable. They created a home that was intimate without becoming secretive. Their life did not revolve around scandal, and their friends did not have to be smuggled through social explanations. They were not dazzling in the way Edward was dazzling. They were something the monarchy would later discover it needed more. At that time, few people imagined Bertie might become king. Edward was healthy, famous, and expected to marry eventually. The line of succession seemed clear. The fact that the more anxious brother was quietly learning how to build a stable household appeared to be a family detail, not a national one. Lascelles noticed details. He also noticed that Edward could be cruel when his insecurity was touched. The prince had a talent for affectionate teasing, but teasing from an heir to the throne was never entirely equal. Others had to laugh. A joke could become a small test of submission. If the target showed hurt, Edward might dismiss the reaction as stiffness. If the target struck back too firmly, he might remember the offense. Lascelles did not enjoy being tested in this way. He had too much pride and too little appetite for flattery. Their exchanges could become sharp, though his position required control. He could not tell the heir everything he thought each time he thought it. The British Constitution had many protections. None included allowing an assistant private secretary to throw the Prince of Wales through a window. So Lascelles did what effective courtiers do. He kept notes in his mind. He distinguished bad days from patterns. He watched how Edward behaved with people who could offer him nothing. He measured promises against performance. The pattern did not improve. In 1924, Britain staged the British Empire exhibition at Wembley. It was vast, expensive, confident, and faintly anxious, like a family giving an enormous party to prove the house was not mortgaged. Pavilions displayed the products, landscapes, industries, and peoples of the empire. There were palaces of engineering and arts, exhibits of timber, minerals, food, machinery, and transport. The event was meant to encourage trade and renew imperial pride at a time when Britain was burdened by debt, unemployment, and doubts about its place in the world. Edward served as president of the exhibition. It was a role suited to his strengths. He could visit sites, charm organizers, speak of cooperation, and lend youth to an enterprise built from old power. On the opening day in April, he welcomed his father before a huge crowd at Wembley Stadium. The ceremony used modern communications to carry royal voices far beyond the people seated there. Technology was changing monarchy. A sovereign no longer spoke only to the room. The room was becoming the nation. Edward understood instinctively that royal performance had to become more direct. He disliked the heavy language favoured by officials. He wanted speeches shorter and contact warmer. Lascelles could agree with that. Modernization was not the problem. The problem was Edward believing that because some traditions were foolish, any restraint he disliked must also be foolish. At Wembley, he looked committed. He toured displays and kept the exhibition in public attention. He could work extremely hard when an undertaking held his interest. This made criticism difficult. Anyone who saw only the public schedule could reasonably ask what more the palace wanted from him. The palace wanted consistency. When Edward cared, he gave energy without limit. When he did not care, duty became an attempt by lesser people to steal his life. Lascelles saw that this was not laziness in the ordinary sense. Edward was capable of exhausting activity. He rode, hunted, danced, travelled, played squash, and pursued social plans with remarkable stamina. His resistance appeared when effort was required for something he had not chosen. A king cannot choose most of what reaches his desk. Political life was changing as quickly as the methods of communication. In January 1924, George V appointed Ramsay MacDonald as the first Labour Prime Minister. Many Conservatives feared that socialism would bring republicanism through the palace gates. George behaved with care. He treated MacDonald correctly, listened to him, and helped make the transition feel constitutional rather than revolutionary. Lascelles watched the king perform one of the least glamorous duties of monarchy. George did not need to admire a government in order to deal with it fairly. He understood that the crown survived by remaining above party even when private opinions pulled strongly in one direction. Edward had broad sympathy for workers and the unemployed. He had seen mines and industrial towns. He disliked the suffering caused by the post-war economy. These instincts made him popular and were often sincere. But sympathy was not the same as constitutional judgment. Edward responded powerfully to people in front of him. He could feel the misery of a miner he had just met. He was less interested in the slow, impersonal work of balancing ministers, law, and precedent. Lascelles feared a future in which Edward would mistake personal compassion for the right to intervene. A prince could say, "Something must be done," and receive applause. A king had to ask who had the authority to do it, who would pay, and what happened when Parliament disagreed. Those questions were dull. They were also the difference between concern and power. In the middle of this public change, Edward continued living as though private life existed in a sealed compartment. Frida remained central. Social weekends continued. His circle encouraged the idea that the prince was overworked, misunderstood, and entitled to relief. Since he really was overworked at times, the excuse could stretch a very long way. The royal family attempted persuasion. Suitable women were placed nearby at dinners and country houses. Hints were made. Conversations about the future appeared and disappeared. Edward resisted not only particular candidates but the whole assumption that others could require him to marry. His refusal had several roots. He feared disappointing a wife. He feared losing freedom. He feared the emotional formality he had seen in the marriage of his parents. He also enjoyed relationships in which the woman could nurture him without fully entering the machinery of the crown. Marriage would place a woman beside him in public and give her claims upon him that could not be answered by a telephone call after midnight. Frida understood his moods and did not threaten his position. That was exactly why the relationship could continue, and exactly why it could never solve the problem. Lascelles was not employed to select a bride. He was employed to help the Prince of Wales function. Yet the absence of a stable household flowed into the office. Edward had no wife who could soften social obligations, create an orderly domestic centre, or tell him privately that he was behaving badly without risking dismissal. Mistresses could soothe him, friends could amuse him, secretaries had to oppose him. He therefore came to resent the people doing the work that intimacy had failed to do. Joan watched Tommy grow harder. Royal service had first promised distinction. It was now becoming a moral argument carried home in silence. Their family was growing, expenses continued, and resignation would not be a theatrical gesture. It would mean giving up salary, status, and a clear career. Lascelles could not simply walk away each time Edward offended him. He had responsibilities of his own. That financial reality increased the bitterness. Edward could speak of escaping duty because duty paid for the escape. Lascelles needed the job that required him to listen. Still, there were periods when hope returned. Edward might complete a difficult run of engagements with grace. He might show real tenderness to a wounded veteran. He might study a speech, accept advice, or apologize after a quarrel. These moments kept the household loyal longer than simple fear ever could. The prince was not an empty man. He had good instincts that appeared suddenly and disappeared just as suddenly. Lascelles came to understand that Edward inspired rescue. People saw the best in him and wanted to protect it. They blamed fatigue, bad companions, parental coldness, the pressure of being heir, or the impossible loneliness of royal life. Each explanation contained truth. Together, they became a shelter from consequence. By 1925, another great tour was being prepared. This time, Edward would travel through West Africa and Southern Africa. The journey would demand months of movement through territories divided by race, language, class, and political memory. In South Africa, the wounds of the Boer War had not vanished. British and Afrikaner loyalties remained complicated. The prince was expected to embody unity where history had supplied very little. For the palace, the tour offered another opportunity to display Edward at his best. For Edward, it offered travel, attention, horses, and escape from the pressures of marriage at home. For Lascelles, it offered a longer test of the question he could no longer avoid. Was Edward difficult because the life was unnatural, or was the life becoming dangerous because Edward could not be trusted with it? The party left Britain in the spring. Gold Coast ceremonies, formal welcomes, military guards, chiefs, governors, railway journeys, and tropical heat followed. Edward again met crowds with startling ease. He could make an imperial visit feel personal for a few minutes at a time. People who had waited for hours saw the smile and believed the day had been worth it. Lascelles saw the minutes between those moments. As the tour moved south, the schedule expanded into a machine of receptions, speeches, inspections, and travel. Special railway carriages carried the royal party across great distances. In South Africa, Edward met political leaders, attended civic events, visited farms and mines, played golf, rode when he could, and stood through ceremonies designed to express loyalties that were often more fragile than the decorations suggested. He was welcomed warmly in many places. In others, enthusiasm was cautious. Some Afrikaners still viewed British royalty through memories of conquest and concentration camps. Black South Africans were presented to the prince within a rigid racial order that the official tour did not challenge. Edward moved through all of it as a symbol of connection, though the connections meant different things to each crowd. Lascelles understood that royal tours were built from selective vision. The prince saw what governors arranged. Poverty could be tidied along a route. Political anger could be kept beyond a barrier. Loyal addresses could be printed while discontent remained unwritten. A successful day did not prove that the society beneath it was settled. Edward preferred the successful day. He had little patience for explanations that complicated applause. He wanted people to like him, and when they did, he treated that affection as evidence that the larger system was sound. Lascelles saw the logical weakness. A crowd could adore the prince and resent the government. A chief could perform loyalty and still bargain for power. A beautiful ceremony could be sincere, strategic, or both. The future king needed to understand that affection was not obedience, and applause was not consent. Instead, Edward seemed more convinced of his personal magic. Each tour told him that he could cross oceans and dissolve difficulty with charm. The officials who prepared the route knew otherwise. The soldiers who secured it knew otherwise. Lascelles, carrying the papers that explained what could not be shown in public, knew otherwise. By the time the royal train pushed deeper into southern Africa, his concern had become more than dislike. Edward sat surrounded by schedules, dispatches, and invitations, yet his attention still moved toward whatever promised relief from them. Outside the windows, stations waited with bands, officials, schoolchildren, veterans, petitioners, and local leaders. Inside, the prince continued treating preparation as a burden placed upon him by people who lacked imagination. The train kept moving because hundreds of others had made certain that it would. Edward looked out at the crowds and saw proof that he was loved. Lascelles looked down at the papers and saw how much love was costing everyone else. In southern Africa, even the landscape seemed to cooperate with Edward's talent for escape. There were long stretches of open country, distant mountains, brilliant skies, and horses waiting at the end of official obligations. The farther the train travelled from London, the easier it became for him to imagine that the part of his life he disliked had been left behind. But the red dispatch boxes still arrived. They contained letters from ministers, reports from the palace, drafts of speeches, requests from organizations, and questions that could not be answered with a smile from a railway platform. Lascelles placed them before the prince, knowing that each document would compete with 100 more attractive possibilities. There might be a polo match, a ride, a private dinner, or merely the pleasure of refusing to be hurried by a secretary. Edward did not always refuse. Some days he sat down, worked through the papers, and astonished everyone with his speed. He could grasp the emotional center of an issue quickly. He knew when official language sounded false. He often improved a speech by removing the grand phrases that courtiers had inserted because they believed royalty required several extra layers of upholstery. Then, just as Lascelles began to believe the prince was maturing, Edward would abandon the work for some immediate pleasure and behave as though the office had created the problem by expecting him to finish. The tour placed him before two powerful white political traditions. English-speaking South Africans often saw the crown as a living tie to Britain. Many Afrikaners carried memories of the South African War, when British forces had fought the Boer republics and civilians had suffered in concentration camps. Some Afrikaner leaders wanted greater independence from Britain. A few were openly Republican. The government was led by General James Hertzog, an Afrikaner nationalist who had once fought against the British. Jan Smuts, his political rival and a former prime minister, was far more comfortable with imperial partnership. The prince was expected to move between these camps without becoming the possession of either. This was monarchy at its most delicate. Edward had to be warm without appearing to bargain. He had to honour old sacrifices without reopening old wounds. He had to represent Britain while allowing South Africans to feel that their own nation was no longer a child waiting for instruction. He did it better than many had expected. Afrikaner audiences who had approached the visit with suspicion often responded to his informality. He appeared less imperial than the machinery surrounding him. He laughed easily, rode well, and seemed impatient with excessive ceremony. That impatience which tormented his staff could look like democratic virtue to people who met him for an afternoon. The newspapers described barriers softening. English loyalists felt encouraged. Officials congratulated one another. The tour was called a success, and in public terms, it was one. Lascelles could see why Edward believed the praise. A political division that had survived war and rebellion appeared to weaken when he entered a room. It was tempting to conclude that instinct had achieved what policy could not. Yet the success had been carefully built. Herzog's government had reasons to welcome the prince politely. Afrikaner leaders could show courtesy without surrendering their goals. Local committees selected routes and arranged audiences. Security officers kept danger at a distance. Journalists favoured stories of reconciliation. Behind every spontaneous cheer stood weeks of planning by people Edward would never know. The prince saw the cheer. Lascelles saw the weeks. The tour also moved through a society governed by racial divisions so severe that ceremonial unity could conceal more than it revealed. Black South Africans appeared in organised welcomes, Traditional displays, labor forces, and delegations permitted to approach the royal visitor. Their lives were controlled by laws and customs that allowed white political rivals to argue over power while keeping most of the population outside the argument. Edward was not sent to challenge that system. A royal tour was designed to confirm order, not question its foundations. Still, Lascelles understood the danger of allowing Edward to believe that the people placed before him represented the whole truth. Royal travel could become a sequence of beautiful deceptions. The roads were swept, the flags raised, and the grievance placed somewhere beyond the prince's view. Edward did not enjoy searching beyond the view. He responded to suffering when it stood directly before him, especially when one face could carry the whole story. Large systems tired him. Their victims moved him. Their details did not. That combination made him emotionally powerful and politically unreliable. He could leave a hospital shaken by the condition of one patient, then lose interest when officials explained what money, law, and administration would be required to help thousands more. He wanted the moral satisfaction of action without the patience needed to understand its price. Lascelles did not doubt the feeling. He doubted what followed it. As the train crossed the country, Edward returned whenever possible to sport, companionship, and the private world that asked less of him. Fruity Metcalfe remained part of the circle. There were late evenings and moments when the prince's pleasure mattered more than the next morning's duty. Lascelles watched men encourage Edward to treat exhaustion as permission. They were not plotting against the monarchy. They were having a good time, which can be more destructive because no one feels responsible for it. A serious advisor could be identified as the person ruining the evening. A cheerful companion merely helped ensure that the morning was ruined instead. Lascelles became increasingly isolated inside the household. He was not alone in recognizing Edward's faults, but others had different ways of surviving them. Some gave in. Some softened advice until it meant almost nothing. Some waited for the prince's mood to improve. Some told themselves that a royal tour was exceptional and that ordinary life at home would restore balance. Lascelles no longer believed ordinary life existed around Edward. Wherever he went, the exceptional followed. By the time the tour ended in the summer of 1925, the prince had again crossed enormous distances, faced countless crowds, and strengthened his position as the most popular royal figure of his generation. The public saw courage, energy, youth, and sympathy. Lascelles returned with something close to dread. The disagreement between them was no longer about work habits. It was about the meaning of duty. To Edward, duty was one part of life. It could be performed well, even brilliantly, and then put aside so that the real person might breathe. To Lascelles, duty was the structure that made royal privilege morally possible. Without it, the titles, houses, servants, trains, income, deference, and protection were simply luxuries charged to people who had never agreed to finance a stranger's freedom. Edward wanted to be judged by his best public moments. Lascelles judged him by what those moments cost. The prince returned home to more praise and a family still waiting for him to settle. He was 31. Bertie and Elizabeth were building the domestic life Edward continued to avoid. Their first child was not yet born, but their marriage already gave the monarchy a reassuring contrast. They looked like two people growing into responsibility together. Edward looked like a man becoming more skilled at escaping it. George V's concern deepened. The king understood that time was moving. His eldest son could not remain permanently suspended between youth and succession. The country expected a future queen. The dynasty needed heirs. Each passing year made Edward's refusal to marry less romantic and more dangerous. But pressure produced resistance. When his parents raised the subject, Edward felt controlled. When advisors mentioned suitable women, he heard a demand that he surrender the only part of life he considered his own. His emotional attachment to Freda Dudley Ward remained intense, even as other married women entered his social orbit. One of them was Thelma Furness, an American-born beauty married to the wealthy Viscount Furness. She belonged to the fashionable world of country weekends, London dinners, private houses, and carefully managed indiscretion. She would become more important to Edward later, but her presence already showed the direction of his taste. He preferred women who were sophisticated, experienced, and unavailable in a respectable, permanent way. Their marriages created obstacles, but obstacles could also provide safety. A married woman could offer excitement and maternal attention while delaying the question of a royal wedding. The arrangement was unfair to almost everyone except Edward, which helped explain its appeal. Lascelles was not policing the prince's bedroom. He was watching the consequences enter the office. Emotional crises changed schedules. Private loyalties influenced public decisions. People gained access because Edward liked them, not because they understood the position he would inherit. The prince protected those who pleased him and distrusted those who asked what their presence might mean. The distinction between friend and advisor became almost impossible. Edward wanted advisors to behave like friends, and friends to be treated like advisors. A secretary who questioned a companion appeared jealous. A companion who encouraged the prince appeared loyal. The household became a court before Edward had a crown, with all the rivalries and none of the constitutional discipline. Then Britain entered one of the most bitter industrial confrontations of the century. Coal had powered the nation, enriched owners, built ports, fed railways, and filled the air of industrial towns with black dust. By the middle of the 1920s, the industry was in crisis. Foreign competition had grown, profits had fallen. Mine owners wanted longer hours and lower wages. Miners believed they were being asked to carry the failure of an entire economic system on their backs. In May 1926, the Trades Union Congress called a general strike in support of the miners. Railway workers, transport workers, printers, dockers, and others stopped work. For 9 days, much of the country entered a tense, unnatural stillness. Volunteers drove buses. Middle-class students moved supplies. Newspapers struggled to appear. The government prepared emergency systems. Rumors spread faster than reliable information. Some feared revolution. Others feared hunger. Most people simply wondered how long the country could remain divided against itself. George V approached the crisis with more understanding than many of his conservative supporters expected. He did not treat the miners as enemies of the crown. He recognized that men could resist wage cuts without plotting to overthrow the monarchy. His position remained constitutional, but his private sympathy helped restrain those who wanted the palace to become a decorative weapon against labor. Edward also felt sympathy for the miners. He had visited industrial communities and seen families living under pressure. He disliked the coldness of people who discussed wages without imagining the dinner table affected by them. His instincts pushed him toward the workers. This was one of the qualities that made the public love him. It was also one of the qualities that worried Lascelles. The prince's compassion moved faster than his judgment. He wanted to speak, to be seen caring, to cross the divide by personal force. But the heir could not casually enter a dispute between an elected government, mine owners, unions, and millions of workers. A sentence intended as kindness could be interpreted as political intervention. A visit could look like royal pressure. A private opinion could appear in a newspaper as the will of the future king. Edward found such caution frustrating. If people were suffering, why should etiquette prevent him from saying so? Lascelles knew the answer. The restraint was not designed to prevent kindness. It was designed to prevent royal sympathy from becoming unaccountable power. A constitutional prince could comfort. He could listen. He could encourage. He could not choose which side of a national struggle deserved the crown. Edward disliked rules most when they blocked an impulse he considered good. That made him especially hard to guide. A selfish impulse could be challenged on moral grounds. A generous impulse came protected by the prince's certainty that opposition was heartless. The general strike ended after 9 days, but the miners remained locked out for months. Families exhausted savings. Food became scarce. Men returned under worse conditions. The dispute left bitterness in mining communities and confidence among those who believed organized labor had been defeated. Edward's concern did not vanish, but concern had to compete with his social life. Lascelles observed a familiar rhythm. The prince could be deeply affected, speak intensely, and then move toward the next experience. The suffering continued after his attention had left. The workers did not have that option. For Lascelles, this exposed the weakness beneath Edward's sympathy. He loved humanity in moments. Kingship required loyalty across years. During the same period, the prince remained one of the hardest working public figures in the family by the simplest measure of visible engagements. He travelled around Britain, opened buildings, attended dinners, met veterans, inspected organizations, and spoke to communities still recovering from war and economic distress. His calendar could be punishing. Supporters used this as proof that criticism was unfair. How could anyone call him undutiful when he appeared at so many events? Lascelles knew the answer but could rarely say it. Duty was not only the number of doors opened or hands shaken, it was the willingness to prepare, to accept advice, to control private appetite, to respect the people arranging the work, and to remember that each promise made in public created labor in private. Edward loved the visible act. He resented the invisible discipline surrounding it. The contradiction wore down the staff. Secretaries learned to approach him at the correct hour, in the correct mood, with the shortest possible explanation. Papers were arranged so the most urgent appeared before his attention weakened. Unpleasant information was presented carefully. Plans had to include space for sudden resistance. The office was not merely serving the prince, it was managing him. Edward sensed this and hated it. He did not want to be handled like a difficult patient. Yet he resisted the habits that would have made handling unnecessary. When Lascelles pressed too firmly, the prince could become cutting. When Lascelles withdrew, Edward accused the office of failing to help. There was no safe distance. Too close meant humiliation. Too far meant neglect. At home, Joan saw the result. Tommy returned from work carrying anger that royal discretion prevented him from releasing. Their children were growing. Their household had bills. His career appeared successful from the outside. In 1926, he was appointed a member of the Royal Victorian Order, an honour given personally for service to the sovereign and royal family. The decoration should have marked pride. Instead, Lascelles treated it with grim amusement. He had won the Military Cross during war. Now he had received another royal distinction for looking after the king's eldest son, and he was no longer certain which campaign had demanded more restraint. The honour did not repair the relationship. It made departure harder. Leaving after being rewarded could look ungrateful. Staying meant continuing to spend his intelligence on preventing problems created by a man who resented prevention. Lascelles began to wonder whether service itself could become a form of dishonesty. By smoothing Edward's failures, the household protected the monarchy. But it also protected Edward from the knowledge that he was failing. Every corrected schedule taught him that lateness had no cost. Every rewritten letter taught him that neglect could be repaired. Every silenced complaint taught him that offended people would remain silent. The more efficiently the staff worked, the less reason the prince had to change. Lascelles was becoming excellent at preserving the habits he despised. In 1927, another Canadian journey brought the conflict into sharper focus. Canada was celebrating 60 years since Confederation. Edward travelled with his younger brother, Prince George, across a country that already held a special place in his imagination. He had visited Canada several times and owned a ranch near Pekisko in Alberta. The property gave him something royal palaces could not. It allowed him to imagine himself as a private landowner beneath a vast sky, concerned with horses, cattle, sheep, fences, and weather rather than ministers and succession. The ranch was not truly ordinary. Staff prepared for him. Security followed. Money and status protected the experiment. But Edward could dress informally, ride across open land, and believe he had stepped outside the institution that paid for his freedom. He loved Canada partly because it gave him a flattering version of independence. The official tour began with ceremonies in the East. Edward and George attended celebrations, opened important public works, met political leaders, and moved through crowds that greeted them with enormous enthusiasm. In Toronto, they opened the new Union Station and the Prince's Gates at the Canadian National Exhibition Grounds. There were speeches, dinners, military displays, and railway journeys across distances that made Britain seem like a well-furnished corridor. Edward again performed beautifully. He was older now, more confident, and even more practiced at finding the human note in a formal occasion. He could make a Canadian veteran feel that the Empire had remembered him. He could turn a stiff reception into a warm one. He could step onto the rear platform of a train and create a memory for a town in minutes. Prince George, lively and charming but more vulnerable beneath the surface, followed his elder brother's lead. Edward could be affectionate toward him. He also drew George into the fast social world that surrounded the heir. The younger prince admired him, and Edward enjoyed admiration most when it came without correction. Lascelles watched both brothers with concern. George had weaknesses of his own, but he did not carry the immediate burden of succession. Edward did. Every indulgence in his case had a constitutional shadow. As the tour moved west, the prince's public success again collided with private disorder. There were parties, drink, women, sudden preferences, and the familiar belief that the official program should yield to whatever desire had captured him. Lascelles had seen it across continents. In Canada, something inside him hardened beyond recovery. He no longer thought Edward was merely immature. Immaturity suggests movement. Edward was moving, but in the wrong direction. Popularity had confirmed his belief that charm would rescue him. Staff efficiency had confirmed his belief that mistakes disappeared. Friends had confirmed his belief that restraint was joyless. Women had confirmed his belief that emotional need excused selfishness. The prince was not growing out of his habits. He was building a philosophy around them. At some point in the growing despair of that year, Edward made an admission to Lascelles. He said that he was the wrong sort of person to be Prince of Wales. It was a startling moment because it showed self-knowledge. Edward understood more than his conduct suggested. He knew the duties did not suit him. He knew his temperament resisted the role. He knew other people spent their lives making his life possible. But the admission did not lead to reform. It became another plea for sympathy. Lascelles saw the trap. Edward could recognize his weakness and use that recognition to avoid changing it. He confessed before others could accuse. Then, having been honest, he seemed to feel released from responsibility. A man who does not know his defect may be taught. A man who knows it, describes it accurately, and continues to demand accommodation is far harder to save. Lascelles' despair became so severe that he spoke privately to Stanley Baldwin, one of the most important political figures in Britain, and a man who would later stand at the centre of Edward's fate. Lascelles told him, in substance, that the heir was pursuing drink, women, and personal whims so recklessly that he was becoming unfit to wear the crown. It was an extraordinary warning. Courtiers did not casually tell senior politicians that the future king lacked the character to be king. Lascelles was not spreading gossip. He was reporting what he believed to be a danger to the state. His language became even darker. He said that sometimes, while waiting for Edward to return from some reckless amusement, he thought the best outcome for the prince and the country might be a fatal riding accident. It was a brutal thought, and Lascelles knew it. He had served in war and did not treat death as a clever phrase. He was not calmly planning harm. He was describing the point at which his loyalty had broken into hopelessness. The monarchy depended on an accident of birth. Lascelles had reached the terrible conclusion that only another accident might save it. Edward remained outside, admired, photographed, and cheered. The crowd saw the future king. His own secretary had begun to fear the day he would become one. Lascelles did not resign in a fit of temper. That would have been easier for everyone, especially Edward, who understood explosions better than conclusions. He remained through the Canadian tour, completed the work, returned to Britain, and spent the next 2 years discovering whether his judgment might soften once ordinary routine resumed. It did not. The ordinary routine was the problem. The prince continued to arrive before cheering crowds with the confidence of a man who believed affection settled every argument. He opened hospitals, spoke to veterans, inspected regiments, attended dinners, and visited industrial towns where unemployment had stripped families of savings and pride. He could make people feel that the monarchy had noticed them. In a country still marked by war losses and economic uncertainty, that gift was not small. But inside the household, the same old struggle continued. Papers waited. Appointments moved. Private companions occupied hours that public obligations had already claimed. Advice was accepted when it suited him and treated as interference when it did not. Lascelles had tried firmness, patience, silence, explanation, and the careful art of placing an unpleasant fact beside a pleasant breakfast. None had changed the essential arrangement. Edward expected the office to protect him from the consequences of ignoring the office. By 1929, Lascelles had served him for nearly 9 years. He had crossed continents, managed tours, absorbed insults, and watched the most popular prince in the world become increasingly certain that popularity was a substitute for self-command. He had also reached an age when a man could no longer pretend that endurance was the same as purpose. He was 42, married, and responsible for children. Royal service had consumed much of the first decade of his marriage. Joan had accepted absences, uncertain hours, and the particular loneliness of living with someone who could describe almost nothing about the work troubling him. The salary mattered. So did the status. A post in the Prince of Wales's household opened doors that ability alone did not always open in Britain. Leaving would mean abandoning a clear path toward the highest offices of the royal household. It would also mean admitting that Lascelles had failed to improve the man he served. That part hurt his pride. He had believed discipline could be taught through example. He had believed that age, experience, and the approach of kingship would force Edward to change. Instead, the prince had become more skilled at defending himself. Every criticism could be answered with a public triumph. Every complaint could be dismissed as the work of a stiff courtier who did not understand modern life. Edward was not entirely wrong about the court. Some of its customs were absurd. Some officials confused dignity with boredom. Some speeches appeared to have been written by furniture. He was right to challenge much of it. That made his deeper failures harder to expose. He could point to a foolish rule and use it to discredit all rules. He could identify one pompous advisor and treat every advisor as pompous. He could modernize a ceremony while refusing to modernize himself. Lascelles finally decided that continued service would damage both of them. He had grown too contemptuous to advise honestly without anger. Edward had grown too suspicious to receive his advice without resentment. Their relationship had become a machine for producing bitterness. The resignation was handled privately, as royal departures usually were. There would be no public declaration that the heir's own secretary considered him unfit for the role ahead. The palace could not allow such a truth to walk freely through Fleet Street. Officially, Lascelles was moving on. Privately, he was escaping. Edward did not respond with the kind of self-examination Lascelles may once have hoped to inspire. He was hurt, irritated, and inclined to interpret the departure personally. In his view, loyalty meant remaining close when he wanted someone close. A servant who left was not simply choosing another life. He was withdrawing affection. This was one of Edward's most revealing habits. He demanded the emotional loyalty of friendship from men whose professional advice he ignored. He wanted them to care deeply, speak gently, and stay indefinitely. In return, he reserved the right to treat their judgment as optional. Lascelles left in 1929 with no confidence that Edward had understood anything. The timing was almost symbolic. That year, the world's financial system began collapsing with a speed that exposed how fragile the prosperity of the 1920s had been. The crash on Wall Street spread through banks, trade, factories, farms, and households. Britain had already struggled with industrial decline. Now unemployment rose further. Shipyards fell quiet. Coal communities suffered. Men who wanted work stood in lines that made personal failure look like a national arrangement. Edward's public sympathy remained powerful. He visited distressed districts and listened to people who felt abandoned by politicians and employers. His face carried concern well because the concern was often real. Yet he returned from those visits to a private life of expensive houses, travel, servants, horses, tailored clothes, and friends who could turn almost any week into a holiday. He did not create the inequality around him. He had been born into it. but he rarely examined how his own choices looked beside the suffering that moved him so strongly in public. Fort Belvedere became the physical centre of that contradiction. The house stood in Windsor Great Park, close enough to the royal family to remain within its orbit and far enough away to feel like freedom. George V allowed Edward to use it in 1929. It was not a vast palace, but it had history, privacy, attractive grounds, and enough distance from formal court life to become the prince's personal kingdom. Edward threw himself into improving it. He altered rooms, chose decorations, developed the gardens, and took pleasure in practical details. He could become intensely focused on a house because a house obeyed personal taste in a way a constitution did not. Walls could be moved, furniture could be replaced, a garden could be redesigned without consulting Parliament. Money went into making Fort Belvedere comfortable, stylish, and separate. It became a place for dinners, weekends, riding, swimming, gardening, and the intimate social life Edward preferred. Friends could arrive without the full machinery of Buckingham Palace. Married women could be received with greater discretion. The future king could imagine himself as a country gentleman who happened to have several nations waiting for him to grow up. Lascelles was no longer there to manage the invitations. For Edward, this was a relief. He surrounded himself with people less inclined to question the emotional structure of his life. Freda Dudley Ward remained important. Thelma Furness grew closer. Both women were married. Both understood fashionable society. Both knew that the prince required constant reassurance and little pressure toward permanence. He divided affection without believing he was deceiving himself. Each relationship existed in its own emotional room. He could write intensely to one woman, spend time with another, and still regard his feelings as completely sincere. Sincerity was never Edward's main problem. He often meant what he said at the moment he said it. The difficulty was that each moment expected to rule everything that followed. Lascelles, meanwhile, had to build another career. He did not abandon royal service entirely. Men of his background rarely changed worlds with theatrical speed. His knowledge of court life, government, and the dominions remained valuable. In 1931, he became secretary to the Governor-General of Canada, the Earl of Canada gave him distance from Edward and a closer view of constitutional monarchy functioning under strain. The country was suffering terribly from the Depression. Wheat prices had collapsed. Farms faced ruin. Factories closed. Unemployment spread through cities. Relief payments were small and often humiliating. Men traveled in search of work, carrying their belongings and hoping the next town had not already run out of hope. The Governor-General could not solve the crisis. He did not control budgets or create jobs. His role was to represent the crown, advise carefully, encourage public service, and avoid pretending that sympathy gave him powers he did not possess. This was exactly the lesson Edward resisted. Lascelles watched Lord Bessborough carry out ceremonial duties while respecting elected ministers. The work demanded restraint, preparation, and an understanding that the representative of the crown must sometimes say less than he felt. A careless phrase could suggest interference from Britain. A foolish gesture could inflame political resentment. Personal popularity had value, but only if it served the office rather than competing with it. In Ottawa, Lascelles saw that monarchy did not survive because every royal figure was charming. It survived because the crown could be present without trying to dominate. The power of the role came partly from refusing to use it for personal satisfaction. Distance did not make him kinder toward Edward. It gave him a constitutional comparison, and Edward did badly in it. The prince visited South America in 1931, travelling to Argentina for the opening of a British trade exhibition in Buenos Aires. Britain needed exports. Businesses needed markets. The government hoped royal prestige would support trade at a time when orders and jobs mattered desperately. Edward again proved highly effective in public. He met officials, attended ceremonies, and carried British confidence into rooms where commercial negotiations sat behind every toast. He could make trade promotion look glamorous. Manufacturers valued the attention. Newspapers praised the mission. Yet the tour also revealed how royal travel mixed national purpose with private pleasure. Edward enjoyed riding, polo, society, and the release of being abroad. He could devote himself energetically to engagements and still treat the spaces around them as his personal reward. That mixture was accepted because the public result looked successful. Britain gained attention. The prince gained freedom. The staff carried the difference. Lascelles followed reports from Canada and recognized the familiar pattern. Edward remained the greatest performer in the royal family. Nothing suggested he had become more In January 1931, a meeting occurred that would eventually turn every private warning into public crisis. Thelma Furness invited Edward to a house party at Borough Court in Leicestershire. Among the guests were Ernest Simpson and his wife, Wallis. Wallis Simpson was an American woman in her mid-30s, born Bessie Wallace Warfield in Baltimore. Her childhood had been financially uncertain, though she moved within respectable social circles through family connections. Her father died when she was an infant, and she grew up understanding that security could depend on relatives, presentation, and the ability to hold one's place in a room. She was not considered a great beauty in the conventional manner of royal mistresses. She was thin, sharply dressed, controlled, and socially alert. She knew how to direct conversation. She could flatter without appearing submissive, and tease without immediately becoming vulgar. In a world where most people treated Edward as a sacred object, Wallis treated him like a man who might be improved by contradiction. Her first marriage, to Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., a naval aviator, had ended in divorce. The marriage had been unhappy and unstable. Her second husband, Ernest Simpson, was a shipping businessman, calm, sociable, and willing to live in a circle where friendship with the Prince of Wales could become both an honour and a danger. At their first meeting, Wallis did not instantly replace every other woman in Edward's life. Later retellings would make the encounter feel inevitable because history enjoys pretending that disasters announce themselves at dinner. In reality, she entered gradually. She and Ernest were invited again. They became part of the prince's social circle. Wallis observed his habits, his insecurities, and the strange mixture of authority and dependence around him. She saw that he liked women who could make decisions, organize comfort, and give him the feeling of being privately understood. She also saw that the people around him were accustomed to yielding. Wallis did not always yield. She could criticize his clothes, disagree with his opinions, and deny him the automatic worship that had made other relationships easy. Edward found this exciting. Resistance made attention feel valuable. He had spent his life surrounded by people who obeyed the title. Wallis appeared to respond to the man. Whether she fully understood the danger at first is uncertain. Friendship with the Prince of Wales brought invitations, influence, and social importance. It also placed her inside a system where ordinary boundaries could disappear politely. Ernest Simpson did not immediately object. The prince's friendship elevated the couple. They dined at Fort Belvedere. They moved closer to the centre of a world that money alone could not purchase. Ernest was treated warmly and remained part of the arrangement. Edward had long depended on husbands who preferred discretion to confrontation. While Wallis moved closer, Lascelles continued serving in Canada. The Depression deepened. Political anger grew. In some places, people blamed banks, governments, foreigners, or the entire economic order. The Crown had to represent stability without appearing indifferent. Lascelles saw Lord Bessborough and his wife support cultural projects, charities, and public events while the country struggled. The Governor-General's household still required money, ceremony, and staff, but there was greater awareness that display could become offensive during hardship. Expenditure had to be judged not only by what was affordable, but by what was defensible. Edward rarely thought in those terms. His homes and entertainments were not the most extravagant in aristocratic Britain, but his position made every private choice symbolic. He wanted modern comfort, freedom, and elegance while disliking questions about who paid, who arranged, and what example was being set. Fort Belvedere became more elaborate as the economic crisis continued. The gardens flourished, guests arrived, the prince escaped London. Outside the gates, unemployment remained high. His defenders could reasonably say that one house did not cause the depression and one cancelled dinner would not reopen a factory. That was true. But monarchy had never depended only on practical arithmetic. It depended on the story a nation told itself about privilege and service. Lascelles believed Edward wanted the privileges without accepting that the story required discipline. By 1934, Wallace had become increasingly important. Thelma Furness travelled to the United States and, according to later accounts, trusted Wallace to keep an eye on Edward while she was away. It was a remarkable delegation of responsibility. The prince's mistress had effectively asked another married woman to supervise him. Edward did not enjoy being supervised, but he enjoyed deciding who would do it. During Thelma's absence, his attachment to Wallace intensified. When Thelma returned, she found that the emotional position she had occupied was no longer secure. Edward could end relationships with startling coldness once his dependence moved elsewhere. Years of intimacy did not guarantee a farewell proportionate to the devotion given. Frida Dudley Ward learned the same lesson. For more than a decade, she had been his confidant, refuge, and emotional center. Then the calls diminished. Access narrowed. The prince, who had written as though he could not live without her, discovered that he could, provided another woman answered. There was cruelty in the speed of the replacement, though Edward may not have understood it that way. He believed feelings justified themselves by their intensity. If his love had shifted, then the shift was the truth. The pain left behind belonged to the past, and he was already living in the present. Wallace became the present. She took a stronger role in his private life than Frida or Thelma had dared to take. She organized dinners, influenced clothes, directed household details, and spoke with the authority of someone certain that Edward wanted to be directed. She could scold him, refuse him, and make him work for approval. To outsiders, the relationship looked unequal in the opposite direction from what rank suggested. He was the heir to the throne. She behaved as though he were the anxious member of the household. That was precisely why he clung to her. Wallace gave structure to the private life that public duty had failed to control. She chose, corrected, and arranged. Edward experienced her authority as love because it relieved him of the burden of deciding while allowing him to call the decision his own. The danger was not merely that she was American, divorced, or married. The danger was that Edward had found a person around whom he was willing to reorganize everything. By 1935, Lascelles' Canadian service was ending. He had spent 4 years watching constitutional monarchy operate through restraint, patience, and respect for elected government. He had also watched from a distance as Edward's private circle narrowed around a woman who now appeared at dinners, holidays, and gatherings with growing confidence. Then Lascelles returned to Britain and entered the service of George V as an assistant private secretary. He had escaped Edward's household only to return to the palace as Edward moved closer to the throne. The king was approaching 70 and his health was failing. The war, heavy smoking, and years of work had taken their toll. His breathing was often difficult, his strength declined. Yet he remained disciplined, still attending to boxes and appointments with the stubbornness that had defined his reign. In May 1935, the country celebrated his silver jubilee. Crowds filled London, streets were decorated. The royal family appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. George was astonished by the affection shown to him. He had never possessed Edward's natural charm, but after 25 years the public had come to value his steadiness. The contrast between father and son could not have been clearer. George had spent a lifetime doing things he did not especially enjoy because he believed the crown required them. Edward had spent a lifetime doing required things brilliantly enough to protect his refusal to be ruled by them. Lascelles now stood inside the king's household with direct knowledge of both men. He saw the old sovereign weakening. He saw the heir growing more dependent on Wallace. He saw courtiers attempting to avoid a confrontation by pretending the relationship would settle into the familiar pattern of a royal affair. But Wallace was not being treated as one more discreet companion. Edward wanted her beside him continually. He took her abroad. He included her in gatherings where her presence unsettled people who understood court etiquette. He allowed her influence to become visible. George V noticed. The king had tolerated many things in his sons that he did not approve of. He knew royal men had affairs. He was not shocked by the existence of a mistress. What alarmed him was Edward's emotional surrender to a married woman who did not appear willing to remain in the shadows. The older king began to fear that his eldest son would not merely embarrass the family, he might endanger the crown. Lascelles had reached the same conclusion years earlier. Now he watched it arrive at the centre of the palace, no longer as a private judgment spoken to a politician in confidence, but as a threat advancing toward a sick king's bedroom. He had left Edward because he believed he could not save him. 6 years later he returned to discover that no one else had saved him either. No one else had saved him either. By January 1936, the question was no longer whether Edward might eventually become ready for the crown. The crown was coming for him, ready or not. George V spent his final Christmas at Sandringham. The house held the familiar rituals of a royal family trying to behave normally around a dying man. Meals were served, guests spoke quietly, doctors came and went. Queen Mary remained composed because composure was the language in which she had been trained to express almost everything, including fear. The king had been ill before, but this decline felt different. His breathing worsened, his strength faded. Family members were summoned. Edward arrived as the eldest son, the heir who had spent much of his adult life resisting the future, now waiting in the next room. Lascelles watched the old structure prepare to transfer itself. The death of a sovereign was personal for the family, but the machinery around it could not mourn until it had completed several urgent tasks. Ministers had to be informed. Proclamations had to be prepared. Officials had to know which words, seals, uniforms, prayers, coins, stamps, and legal forms would change. A man could stop breathing in Norfolk, and within hours millions of documents across an empire required a new name. George V died late on January 20th. Edward was now King Edward VIII. For Queen Mary, the moment contained grief and dread. She had lost her husband, but she also knew the son who had inherited his position. She understood his tenderness, his resentment, his charm, and his capacity to make every private emotion feel more urgent than the obligations around it. The old king had worried about what would happen after his death. His concern was not based only on Wallis Simpson. He had watched Edward resist marriage, discipline, advice, and preparation for years. Wallis had not created these habits. She had simply become the person around whom all of them could unite. Lascelles had reached the same conclusion much earlier. He knew that the new king could perform magnificently when the occasion engaged him. He also knew that a reign could not be managed as a sequence of engaging occasions. The first signs appeared immediately. On January 21st, the Accession Council met at St. James' Palace to proclaim the new sovereign. The ceremony belonged to the state, not to the personality of the man inheriting it. Traditionally, the new monarch did not watch the public proclamation of his own accession. Edward watched from a palace window. Wallis stood with him. To most people outside the palace, the detail meant nothing because they did not know it had happened. To those inside, it was a declaration made without words. Edward had placed a married woman beside him at the first public threshold of his reign. He was not asking whether she belonged there. He was showing that he intended to decide where she belonged. Perhaps he thought the moment private. Perhaps he saw no reason to hide the person closest to him. Perhaps he believed old rules deserved to be ignored. All three explanations led to the same problem. Edward still treated personal sincerity as permission. The palace household now belonged to a man who had spent years resenting the people who ran palace households. Lord Wigram, the private secretary of George V, withdrew. Alec Hardinge became private secretary to the new king. Lascelles remained within royal service, but he was not restored to the confidence he had once held with Edward. That suited Edward. Lascelles represented memory. He knew too much about the tours, the missed papers, the late nights, the married women, and the private confession that Edward considered himself the wrong sort of man to be Prince of Wales. He had seen the charming young prince before the world had mistaken charm for character. Edward preferred advisers who would begin the reign without presenting an invoice for the years before it. Lascelles did not need direct access to understand what was happening. The office revealed the man through decisions, delays, and sudden demands. Edward had inherited the highest position in the country and immediately began searching for ways to live around it. He did not want Buckingham Palace to become his true home. The building represented everything he disliked. It was immense, formal, crowded with staff, and designed for a sovereign whose private life had surrendered to public function. Edward preferred Fort Belvedere, where the rooms, gardens, guests and hours belonged more completely to him. He could be king in London and David at Windsor. The difficulty was that the two men shared one signature. Government papers followed him to Fort Belvedere. Ministers required audiences. Officials needed decisions. Preparations for the coronation began. The royal household had to establish salaries, duties, access, travel and expenditure for a new reign. Parliament approved money to support the household, but this money did not simply enter a private pocket. Much of it paid staff, pensions, ceremonies, official hospitality, and the machinery of monarchy. Edward took an interest in economies. He disliked waste and believed the court could be made smaller and more modern. In some areas, he was right. Royal households collected old positions with the enthusiasm of attics collecting furniture. Jobs survived because no one wished to explain why they had existed. But economy also appealed to his impatience. A smaller court meant fewer officials. Fewer officials meant fewer people entitled to raise objections. Modernization could make the institution leaner, but it could also make the king less supervised. Lascelles recognized the difference. George V had accepted that the royal household was partly a restraint upon the sovereign. Its rules protected him from impulse. Edward viewed the same rules as a conspiracy by older men to prevent happiness. The coronation was fixed for May 12, 1937. Preparations began months in advance because a coronation was not merely one church service. It involved Westminster Abbey, the armed forces, foreign royal families, dominion governments, colonial representatives, transport, security, broadcasting, seating, uniforms, medals, souvenirs, processions, rehearsals, and enough paperwork to make medieval ritual look remarkably modern. Edward wanted the ceremony simplified. Again, his instinct contained sense. The country had endured years of unemployment and economic hardship. An extravagant celebration could appear tone-deaf. The old coronation service was long, complicated, and filled with language few people understood. Edward believed the monarchy should look young, direct, and suited to the age of radio. Yet his manner unsettled the officials responsible for making it happen. He seemed to treat the sacred and constitutional parts of the ceremony as decorative inconvenience. The coronation was meant to bind the sovereign through public promises. Edward approached parts of it as though he were editing an overlong dinner program. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, was already uneasy about him. Lang was formal, powerful, and not easily charmed. He had known the royal family for years and understood that the king would become supreme governor of the Church of England. This did not make Edward a priest, but it did make his personal conduct harder to dismiss as private. The Church taught that marriage was permanent. Divorced people whose former spouses still lived faced serious restrictions upon remarriage in church. Wallis had one living former husband and one current husband. Edward had managed to choose the only woman who could turn romance into a meeting of bishops, lawyers, and Dominion prime ministers. At first, palace officials still hoped the relationship might settle into the accepted pattern of a discreet royal affair. British society was not as innocent as its public manners suggested. Kings and princes had kept mistresses before. The arrangement could survive if everyone understood the boundaries. Wallis did not remain within them. Her presence grew more visible after the accession. She attended gatherings with the king. She received attention from people who understood that access to her might become access to him. Invitations began to carry political weight. Those welcomed by Wallis could move closer to the centre. Those she disliked could find the route less comfortable. Edward enjoyed seeing her treated as important. Each bow and invitation confirmed that the world was accepting the choice he had already made privately. Queen Mary did not accept it. She would not receive Wallis as though she were a legitimate royal companion. Her refusal placed Edward in a position he hated. He wanted both family approval and freedom from family judgment. When denied one, he treated the denial as evidence that the family did not understand him. Bertie and Elizabeth also kept their distance. The Duke of York remained loyal to his elder brother, but loyalty did not require blindness. Elizabeth had built her marriage around steady support, private affection, and public duty. She watched Wallis exercise power without title or responsibility, and saw little reason to admire the arrangement. The two brothers stood on opposite sides of a truth neither wanted spoken. Edward was king because he had been born first. Bertie was more suited to the sacrifices of kingship because he had never wanted it. Bertie did not envy him. That was becoming important. At the centre of the tension stood Wallis herself, a woman whose motives have been simplified ever since. She enjoyed luxury, attention, clothes, travel, and social victory. She could be ambitious, demanding, and cruel in conversation. She could also be trapped by a man whose devotion became more absolute as the danger increased. Edward did not simply love her, he relied upon her. She selected clothes, arranged meals, corrected his habits, managed moods, and gave order to hours that official duty could not control. He became anxious when separated from her. The more others objected, the more necessary she seemed. Opposition did not weaken his attachment. It proved in his mind that only Wallis truly stood beside him. This placed her in a position both powerful and frightening. She could command the king privately, but she could not command the consequences publicly. The British press remained silent. Editors knew about the relationship. Society columnists knew. Political reporters knew. Foreign correspondents certainly knew. American and European newspapers printed photographs and stories connecting Edward and Wallis with increasing boldness. British readers could purchase a newspaper and learn about almost everything except the subject being discussed at dinner tables from London to New York. The silence was partly deference and partly fear. Newspapers had long protected the royal family from intimate exposure. Editors worried that publication could provoke outrage, damage the monarchy, or invite legal trouble. Government figures preferred delay because delay offered the possibility that Edward might recover his judgment before the public became involved. The silence protected Wallis from immediate attack. It also protected Edward from reality. He came to believe that the absence of scandal meant the country did not object. Advisers knew that the country had not been given the chance. This was the same pattern Lascelles had watched for years. Staff removed consequences. Edward mistook their absence for approval. During the summer, the king made the danger impossible to ignore abroad, while it remained strangely invisible at home. Edward chartered the Narlin, a large private yacht owned by Lady Yule, for a cruise through the eastern Mediterranean and Adriatic. The vessel offered luxury without the official character of a royal yacht. It carried comfortable cabins, broad decks, a swimming pool, a bar, a substantial crew, and the useful illusion that a king could travel privately if the yacht happened not to belong to the nation. Wallis joined him. Ernest Simpson did not. The party sailed along the coast of Yugoslavia, visited ports, crossed brilliant water, and attracted photographers wherever it appeared. Edward and Wallis swam, relaxed, entertained, and moved together with the ease of a recognized couple. Foreign newspapers published the pictures. American readers saw the King of Britain holidaying openly with the wife of another man. European observers began discussing not whether the relationship existed, but what Edward intended to do about it. The British press still said almost nothing. From the deck of the Narlin, Edward could imagine that the opposition consisted of a few stiff courtiers and disapproving relatives. Crowds greeted him. Hosts welcomed Wallis. Friends behaved as though the future had already been settled. But the yacht was expensive, the journey visible, and the timing careless. The new king had not yet completed 1 year on the throne. Coronation preparations were underway. Europe was becoming more dangerous. Adolf Hitler had remilitarized the Rhineland in March, openly challenging the restrictions imposed after the First World War. Benito Mussolini had conquered Ethiopia. Spain was descending into civil war. Edward followed foreign affairs, but often through personal impressions. He believed direct contact between rulers could solve problems that diplomats complicated. He admired efficiency and disliked the settlement created after the war. He thought he understood Germany and wanted Britain to avoid another conflict. Peace was a reasonable desire. The danger lay in believing that sincerity across a dining table could replace policy, alliances, and evidence. Lascelles knew Edward tended to trust personal instinct over institutions. In private life, that had produced Wallace. In foreign affairs, it could produce something far worse. The king returned from the cruise more committed, not less. By then, Ernest Simpson had formed a relationship with another woman. His marriage to Wallace had been strained for years, but the presence of the king made any separation explosive. Divorce law in England required a legally recognized offence. Couples could not simply agree that the marriage had ended and ask the court to tidy the documents. Wallace petitioned for divorce on the ground of adultery by Ernest. The case had to appear ordinary while containing the most extraordinary unspoken fact in Britain. The court would hear that Ernest had committed adultery. It would not hear that his wife had become the emotional centre of the life of the king. Legal advisers worried about collusion. If a divorce had been arranged rather than honestly proved, it could be challenged. Private investigators and journalists searched for evidence. Servants, hotels, letters, and witnesses acquired national importance without appearing in the national press. Edward encouraged the divorce because he wanted Wallace free. This changed everything. A married mistress could remain a private scandal. A divorced woman preparing to marry the sovereign created a constitutional question. Edward had moved from behaviour the establishment disliked to a decision the government might have to prevent. Stanley Baldwin, now Prime Minister again, approached the matter cautiously. He had known Edward for years. He knew the public affection surrounding him. He also remembered the warning Lascelles had given in 1927, when the possibility of kingship still seemed safely distant. Baldwin was not eager for confrontation. He preferred patience, understatement, and the political use of appearing slower than everyone else until they discovered he had reached the destination first. He hoped Edward might recognize the impossible position before formal advice became necessary. Edward interpreted caution as weakness. He believed that once Wallace was divorced, marriage could be presented as a personal matter. He thought public affection would protect him. He suspected that objections came from old-fashioned courtiers, hostile churchmen, jealous women, and ministers who did not understand modern attitudes. There was some truth in every suspicion, which allowed him to ignore the larger truth. The king was not free to marry exactly as a private man could. His wife would become queen unless Parliament created some other arrangement. She would appear beside him in ceremonies, receive foreign leaders, influence access, and share in the public meaning of the crown. The governments of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State also had interests, because Edward was their king as well. He could not settle the matter in a drawing room at Fort Belvedere. Wallace obtained her decree nisi at Ipswich on October 27th. The hearing was brief. Ernest was found to have committed adultery. The decree would not become final for several months, leaving time for legal challenges. Outside the court, reporters waited. Abroad, newspapers treated the decision as a step toward a royal marriage. In Britain, millions remained unaware that their king was planning a future queen. Wallace returned to Edward with the first legal barrier weakened. The human cost was already spreading. Ernest Simpson lost his wife and watched his private failure become material for international speculation. Freda Dudley Ward had been discarded after years of devotion. Thelma Furness had been replaced. Queen Mary faced the possibility that the woman she refused to receive might occupy the place she had held beside George V. Bertie and Elizabeth saw the crown moving closer to their own quiet household without knowing whether it would arrive through death, scandal, or both. Princess Elizabeth was 10 years old. She lived with her parents and younger sister in a protected domestic world. Her lessons, ponies, dogs, and family routines belonged to the childhood of a royal niece, not the preparation of a future sovereign. Every step Edward took toward Wallace moved the child closer to the throne. Lascelles saw the chain of consequences because that was how he understood character. Edward saw one love obstructed by rules. Lascelles saw a father being pushed toward a role he dreaded, a mother being forced toward public duty, 2 children losing the shape of their lives, governments being drawn into a marriage, and an institution being asked to risk itself so that one man would not have to choose. This was why Lascelles had never trusted him. Edward could feel deeply, but he counted the depth of his own feeling more carefully than the cost paid by others. In November, the king visited the distressed districts of South Wales. The coal industry remained devastated. Mines had closed. Unemployment had consumed towns that once supplied the power of the British economy. Men stood idle in places built around work. Families lived on assistance that preserved life without restoring purpose. Edward was shaken. He walked through poor communities, spoke with unemployed miners, entered homes, and reacted with the same direct sympathy that had made him beloved as Prince of Wales. He reportedly declared that something must be done. The words travelled because they expressed what many people felt. They also alarmed ministers because no one knew what action the king intended, or whether he understood the limits of his role. Here was Edward at his best and most dangerous. He saw pain that comfortable officials could ignore. He gave forgotten people the feeling that the highest person in the country had noticed them. Then he returned to a private battle centred on his own happiness. The contrast did not make his concern false. It made his judgment harder to trust. A king could not demand action from mining families while threatening to throw the government into crisis over a marriage. He could not present himself as the servant of distressed communities while treating constitutional restraint as a personal insult. Sympathy without sacrifice was becoming the pattern of his reign. By the middle of November, Harding understood that silence had become dangerous. The court case had changed the timetable. Foreign coverage was growing, coronation preparations continued, invitations, seating plans, souvenirs, uniforms, and commercial orders were being produced for a ceremony whose central woman had not been decided. Businesses were spending money. Governments were arranging delegations. Families were saving for travel to London. The nation was preparing to crown a king who had not decided whether he would accept the conditions of remaining king. Harding wrote Edward a stark warning. The relationship could not remain hidden. The British press would soon publish. The government would be forced to act. Edward was furious. He believed his own private secretary had joined the opposition. He did not see Harding as a servant trying to protect the sovereign. He saw betrayal. Lascelles had seen the same reaction many years earlier. Edward wanted honest loyalty until honesty interfered with desire. Then loyalty meant silence. Baldwin now had to meet the king and ask the question everyone had delayed. What exactly did Edward intend to do when Wallace became free to marry? The answer would determine the future of the crown, the government, the royal family, and a 10-year-old princess who still believed her uncle would remain king for the rest of his life. Edward believed the confrontation was about whether he could have Wallace. Lascelles knew it was about whether Edward had ever understood that a crown could not belong to the man wearing it. Baldwin knew that a king could not be defeated like an ordinary politician. He had to be persuaded, contained, or allowed to defeat himself. When the Prime Minister met Edward at Buckingham Palace in November 1936, he did not begin with romance. He began with government. Edward said he intended to marry Wallis Simpson after her divorce became final. Baldwin explained that the marriage would be unacceptable to his ministers and to the governments of the dominions. The problem was not simply that Wallis was American. It was not simply that she had been divorced. It was that she would have 2 living husbands, and the king was the formal head of a church that did not recognize her freedom to remarry in the way Edward required. There were also questions of character, influence, security, and public confidence, though officials had to speak carefully. Rumours circulated about Wallis's friendships, her spending, her access to state papers, and the people who gathered around her. Some rumours were exaggerated, others could not be proved. The uncertainty itself was dangerous. Edward listened, but he did not accept the premise. He believed Baldwin was describing prejudice as necessity. Social attitudes were changing. Divorce was becoming more common. Americans did not tremble at the opinions of British duchesses. The king imagined that the public once told the truth. would recognize a great love and sweep aside the objections of ministers, bishops, courtiers, and relatives. It was the oldest mistake in Edward's life. He confused being loved with being obeyed. Baldwin told him that if he married Wallace against ministerial advice, the government would resign. That would force a general election. The election would not be fought over coal, unemployment, defence, or foreign policy. It would become a national vote on the king's marriage. Candidates would be asked to support Edward or oppose him. The crown would be dragged into party politics, exactly where a constitutional monarchy could not survive. Edward had always believed he stood above politics because crowds cheered him. He now learned that one personal choice could turn him into the largest political issue in the country. He considered another possibility. Perhaps he could marry Wallis without making her queen. This was called a morganatic marriage. The term came from European royal practice. It meant that a ruler could marry a woman of lower rank without giving her his title, and their children would not inherit the throne. Edward would remain king. Wallis might receive some lesser title. The crown would be preserved, and the marriage would be treated as private. To Edward it seemed an elegant compromise. To the British constitutional system, it was an arrangement that did not exist. Parliament would have to create it. The dominions would have to agree. The public would be asked to accept a king's wife who was neither queen nor fully private. Every banquet, state visit, church service, and family ceremony would raise the same question. Where did Wallis sit? Who bowed to her? What rank did she hold? Could she accompany the king? Could she influence him? Would foreign governments treat her as the sovereign's wife or as an unofficial companion with a specially designed title? Edward had spent years dismissing etiquette as foolish. Now etiquette became the visible surface of constitutional power. Baldwin consulted the Dominion governments. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State did not all think alike, but there was little support for the solution Edward wanted. Their ministers understood that the king was not only king of the United Kingdom, he was their king too. His marriage could not be settled as though the empire were a family estate and they were distant tenants. The prime ministers of the dominions had their own parliaments, voters, churches, and political pressures. Some feared the moral issue, some feared instability, some feared that allowing the marriage would weaken the crown and encourage republican movements. None wished to inherit a scandal designed at Fort Belvedere. Edward regarded this resistance as another example of officials making his private life unnecessarily complicated. Lascelles would have recognized the thought immediately. The complication was always caused by the person who noticed the consequences, never by the person creating them. While ministers consulted across oceans, Wallis remained near the center of the storm. She had travelled to France, partly to escape the pressure and partly because her presence in Britain had become impossible to manage. Reporters followed her. Telephone calls crossed the channel. Messages moved through friends and lawyers. Edward's dependence became more intense with distance. Wallis began to understand that the situation had gone beyond the glamorous inconvenience of an affair with a king. She had expected social hostility. She may not have expected governments to exchange formal opinions about whether she could marry. Her life was examined in public before the British public had even been told the full story. Her first marriage, second marriage, clothes, manners, friendships, letters, and facial expressions became evidence. Those who hated her made her into a calculating adventurer. Those who defended her made her into a woman persecuted for love. The truth was less tidy. Wallis had enjoyed her rise. She liked influence and luxury. She had accepted jewels, attention, and a place inside royal life. She had also tried at times to keep Edward from acting recklessly. But by late 1936, his love had become a pressure no ordinary person could control. He told her that life without her was impossible. A declaration like that sounds romantic until it is made by a king responsible for several nations. Wallis offered to withdraw. She sent statements suggesting that she was prepared to give up Edward if that would solve the crisis. Whether she hoped he would accept is uncertain. She may have wanted escape. She may have wanted to prove sacrifice. She may have known that Edward would treat the offer as further evidence of her nobility. He refused to release her. By the end of November, the British press could no longer maintain silence. Foreign newspapers were available in Britain. American radio discussed the affair. Members of Parliament asked questions. Rumour had become more damaging than publication. On December 2nd, the story broke openly. For millions of British people, Wallis Simpson appeared almost overnight. One day she was a name known to society and foreign readers. The next, she was being discussed as the possible wife of the king. The public reaction was not uniform. Some admired Edward's determination. They saw a modern man refusing to be trapped by old rules. Some believed he should be allowed to marry for love. Women who had endured cold or unhappy marriages could understand the appeal of a sovereign, choosing emotion over arrangement. Others were shocked by the divorce issue, the secrecy, and the thought of Wallis as queen. Church leaders objected. Respectable households argued over breakfast. Newspaper offices received letters in huge numbers. Crowds gathered near royal residences. Shops displayed portraits. Political groups attempted to turn the crisis toward their own causes. Edward finally received the public drama he had long believed would rescue him. It did not rescue him. The affection was real, but it was divided. There was no overwhelming national demand that ministers surrender. Many of the people who loved Edward as Prince of Wales did not want Wallis crowned beside him. They could pity his position and still believe a king had duties greater than marriage. He had expected the public to choose between himself and Baldwin. A large part of the public did not believe a king should ask them to make that choice. Edward considered appealing directly to the nation through a broadcast. He wanted to explain his love, his sense of injustice, and his proposed compromise. A broadcast had always been one of his great strengths. His voice could cross the distance between palace and sitting room. He believed he could speak honestly and let the people decide. Baldwin refused. A royal broadcast given against ministerial advice would itself be political. The king would be using the authority of the crown to campaign against his government. If ministers resigned after the speech, Edward would need to find another prime minister prepared to support him. Some people around the king encouraged the possibility. Winston Churchill, then outside the government, argued that Edward should be given more time and warned against forcing a decision. Churchill's position was complicated. He valued the monarchy, disliked Baldwin, and believed procedure was being rushed. He also misjudged the strength of support available to the king. A group began to form around Edward, but it was not broad enough to govern. It included loyal friends, some politicians hostile to Baldwin, newspaper figures, and people attracted to the excitement of standing near a throne in danger. They offered sympathy, delay, and grand ideas. They did not offer a stable majority in the House of Commons. Baldwin had one enormous advantage. He understood that the crisis was not a contest between two personalities. It was a test of whether the king could act without responsible ministers. Edward never fully accepted that distinction. He believed he was being prevented from marrying. Baldwin believed he was preventing the crown from becoming a personal instrument. Queen Mary watched the crisis with rigid sorrow. She loved her son, but she could not accept his argument. Her marriage to George V had not begun as a modern romance. It had been shaped by dynasty, duty, and the death of George's elder brother, who had originally been expected to marry her. Over time, affection and partnership had grown. Mary had spent her life subordinating private feeling to the crown. Now Edward asked the family to treat his private feeling as more important than the crown itself. To him, this made her cold. To her, it made him faithless. Bertie was horrified. He still hoped some solution could keep his brother on the throne. He did not want the crown. He feared public speaking. He knew his health, nerves, and stammer made royal performance painful. He had a wife and 2 daughters who had not been raised to expect that their household might become the centre of national life. Elizabeth understood before many others that Edward's choice could destroy their privacy. She had spent years helping Bertie manage public duty. She had supported speech treatment, prepared for engagements, and built a home where he could recover from the pressure of royal expectations. If Edward abdicated, none of that life would remain untouched. She could not openly attack him. She could not plead for herself. She had to wait while her brother-in-law decided whether her husband and children would pay the price of his refusal. Princess Elizabeth sensed the tension without being told everything. Adults changed conversations when she entered. Her father's schedule became uncertain. Her mother was anxious. Newspapers carried the face of a woman the child had never met. The future was approaching her through rooms full of whispers. Lascelles watched the crisis from within royal service, with the grim recognition of a man seeing an old prediction become national fact. Nearly a decade earlier, he had told Baldwin that Edward might be unfit to wear the crown. Now Baldwin was attempting to manage the exact danger Lascelles had described. There was no satisfaction in being right. Lascelles knew how much Edward had once been loved. He knew the prince's kindness to veterans, his instinctive sympathy for the unemployed, his ability to make a frightened person feel at ease. He had seen him tired, lonely, and desperate for affection. He also knew that pity could not be allowed to write the Constitution. Hardinge, the king's private secretary, faced the full force of Edward's anger. He had warned the king that the press silence could not last. For this honesty, he was treated as an enemy. The pattern had not changed since Lascelles' time. The men closest to Edward were loyal only when they agreed with him. Those who protected the crown from his wishes were accused of betraying the man. Edward spent tense days at Fort Belvedere. Friends came and went. Telephones rang. Papers arrived. The house that had been created as an escape from kingship became the place where he decided whether to abandon it. There was a strange domestic quality to the crisis. Meals were served. Dogs moved through rooms. Fires were lit against the December cold. Servants carried trays while governments waited. Outside the gates, reporters gathered. Across the empire, ministers waited for cables. At Westminster, members of Parliament debated privately. At York House, Bertie and Elizabeth faced the possible end of the life they knew. Inside Fort Belvedere, Edward still hoped that someone would discover a way for him to avoid choosing. No one did. Baldwin presented the alternatives clearly. Edward could end his plan to marry Wallis and remain king. He could marry her against the advice of ministers, causing the government to resign and provoking a constitutional crisis. Or he could abdicate. The morganatic proposal had failed. The Dominions would not support it. There was no parliamentary path waiting to save him. Edward chose abdication. The decision stunned some of his supporters because they had mistaken intensity for strategy. He had spoken as though he would fight. In the end, he refused the one sacrifice that could have preserved his reign. He would not give up Wallis. On December 10th, 1936, Edward signed the instrument of abdication at Fort Belvedere. His 3 surviving brothers signed as witnesses. Bertie, the Duke of York, stood among them, knowing the document transferred the burden to him. The Duke of Gloucester and the Duke of Kent also signed. The wording was brief. The effect was enormous. Edward declared that he renounced the throne for himself and his descendants. There were no descendants. That absence was part of the tragedy. The family had spent years urging him to marry and provide heirs. Now he left the crown without a wife, without a child, and without the dynasty moving through him. The document then required approval from Parliament and the Dominions. Even abdication was not entirely his personal act. A king could decide to leave, but the constitutional system still had to recognize the departure. On December 11th, Parliament passed the necessary law. Edward ceased to be king. Bertie became King George VI. The choice of name mattered. He did not reign as Albert. He chose George to signal continuity with his father. After a year of instability, the monarchy would return to the name associated with steadiness, family, and endurance. Bertie had not wanted the throne, but wanting had suddenly become irrelevant. That evening, Edward spoke to the nation and empire from Windsor Castle. He had wanted to broadcast during the crisis, when a speech might have challenged the government. Now he was allowed to speak as a man who had already surrendered the crown. His words were carefully prepared. He said he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and discharge his duties as king without the help and support of the woman he loved. The sentence became one of the most famous declarations of romantic sacrifice in modern history. It was also a final example of the habit Lascelles had distrusted. Edward described Wallis as the support he needed to perform his duty. He did not say that he had refused to perform the duty without her. He placed the impossibility outside himself, as though kingship and love had created a trap, and he had merely chosen the more human path. Millions listened in their homes. Some wept. The voice they had known as the Prince of Wales sounded intimate, controlled, and wounded. Radio gave him one last opportunity to turn constitutional failure into personal connection, and he used it brilliantly. He thanked his brother. He spoke of his mother. He expressed loyalty to the new king. He asked for goodwill. He did not attack Baldwin. He did not explain the warnings he had ignored. He did not mention the staff who had protected him, the governments consulted, the ministers placed under pressure, or the family whose future had been overturned. The speech centered the emotional truth Edward understood best. He had lost a throne for love. For many listeners, that was enough. For Lascelles, it was the final proof that Edward could narrate his own surrender more beautifully than he had governed. After the broadcast, Edward left Britain. He crossed the Channel aboard a Royal Navy destroyer and travelled to Austria, where he waited at Schloss Enzersfeld, a castle belonging to friends. Wallis remained in France until her divorce became final. They could not yet appear together as husband and wife. The former king had become His Royal Highness the Duke of Windsor. The title gave him rank but no role. He was still the eldest son of George V, still the brother of the king, still one of the most famous men in the world. Yet he no longer possessed the constitutional purpose that had justified the machinery around him. For the first time, Edward had achieved the freedom he had demanded. It did not feel free. His money became a source of immediate tension. He had private assets, properties, jewels, and income, but questions arose over what belonged to him personally and what had belonged to him as sovereign. Balmoral and Sandringham were private family properties, not state palaces. The new king had to purchase them from Edward. The arrangement was painful and awkward. Bertie had inherited the duties of kingship, then had to pay his brother for access to homes associated with the crown. Edward had always resented discussions of money as vulgar. Money now entered nearly every conversation. The government and royal family had to determine his allowance. The Duke wanted financial security suitable to his position. The palace wanted to prevent him from selling stories, accepting questionable offers, or using poverty as a weapon against the new reign. Bertie felt obligation toward his brother. He also felt betrayed. Elizabeth felt less uncertain. She had watched Edward place the monarchy, her husband, and her daughters in danger for months. She now saw him negotiate over income and property after leaving others to perform the duty he had abandoned. Her resentment would not disappear quickly. Queen Mary remained outwardly formal. She continued writing to Edward, but the wound was profound. In her understanding, abdication was not a romantic act. It was desertion. The title question produced another family conflict. Edward assumed Wallis would share his royal style after marriage. The new king, acting on government advice, decided that she would not be entitled to be called Her Royal Highness. Edward remained a royal duke. Wallis would become Duchess of Windsor, but without the style that would have placed her fully inside the royal family. The decision humiliated them. To Edward, it looked like punishment directed at the woman for whom he had sacrificed everything. To the royal family, it marked a boundary. Wallis would be his wife, but she would not receive the status of the queen she had nearly become. No detail was merely social now. A form of address contained years of anger. The coronation scheduled for May 12, 1937, did not disappear. The date remained. The invitations, uniforms, route plans, seating, and public preparations were redirected toward George VI. The ceremony built for Edward would crown Bertie. This was monarchy's coldest efficiency. The throne had lost one man and continued with another. The processions could be rehearsed again. The name could be replaced. The oath remained. Lascelles understood that continuity was not cruelty, it was survival. The crown could not publicly collapse because the former king was grieving. It had to reassure markets, governments, armed forces, churches, and families that the state remained stable. George VI had to appear before the public before he had fully understood what had happened to him. He struggled with the pressure. His stammer worsened under stress. Official papers multiplied. Ministers arrived. Every gesture was compared with Edward's ease. The brother who had always seemed less suited to public performance now had to repair the damage left by the greatest performer in the family. Elizabeth stood beside him. Her calm was not decorative. It was structural. She helped create confidence around a man who doubted himself. She understood his fears without encouraging retreat. Where Edward had sought a woman who would arrange life around his resistance to duty, Bertie had married a woman who helped him endure duty. The difference would shape the monarchy. Lascelles had once hoped marriage might steady Edward. Marriage had steadied Bertie instead. As the new reign began, the palace needed people who understood constitutional discipline, public feeling, and the private weaknesses of the family. Lascelles possessed all three forms of knowledge. He also possessed something rarer. He had already refused to confuse loyalty to Edward with loyalty to the crown. The man Edward had been glad to lose was about to become indispensable to the brother Edward had forced onto the throne. The man Edward had been glad to lose was about to become indispensable to the brother Edward had forced onto the throne. George VI needed advisers who would tell him the truth without making him feel smaller. That was not simple. The new king was intelligent, dutiful, and brave, but he had spent his life in the shadow of a brother who could enter a room and make confidence look hereditary. Bertie had never expected to rule. His childhood had been shaped by correction. He had been forced to write with his right hand, though he was naturally left-handed. Painful splints had been used to straighten his knees. His stammer made public speaking an ordeal. Edward moved easily through the world, while Bertie seemed to negotiate with every sentence before releasing it. Then Edward walked away, and Bertie inherited not only the crown, but the comparison. Lascelles understood that the new king could not be advised as Edward had been advised. Edward treated caution as an insult because he believed himself naturally right. Bertie feared caution because he suspected everyone else might be right instead. The difference required a different loyalty. Lascelles did not flatter George VI, but neither did he press him merely to prove that he could. He prepared carefully, reduced confusion, and helped create order around a man who worked best when he understood exactly what was expected. The king read his papers. He listened. He worried. He returned to difficult questions rather than escaping from them. He was not dazzling. Lascelles had seen where dazzling could lead. The coronation took place on May 12, 1937, the date originally chosen for Edward. Westminster Abbey received a nervous king and a composed Queen Elizabeth. Foreign royalty, politicians, soldiers, clergy, and representatives from across the empire filled the church. Crowds lined the streets. Rain fell, as though the British weather had decided that constitutional continuity required damp hats. George took the oaths his brother had avoided. He promised to govern according to law, maintain justice, and protect the church. The words were old, but their meaning was painfully immediate. The monarchy had survived because one brother accepted what the other would not. Edward was not present. He remained abroad, waiting to marry Wallis. On June 3, 1937, the Duke of Windsor and Wallis Simpson were married at the Château de Conde in France. No member of the royal family attended. The Church of England would not perform the ceremony, so a British clergyman, Robert Anderson Jardine, conducted it despite the opposition of his bishop. The wedding was elegant, intimate, and wounded. Wallis wore a pale blue dress designed for the occasion. Edward looked relieved to have reached the moment for which he had surrendered the throne. But victory did not feel complete. Wallis was now Duchess of Windsor, but she was not Her Royal Highness. Edward never accepted that decision emotionally. He believed the family had denied his wife the dignity owed to her. The family believed he had already demanded more than duty, patience, and affection could reasonably supply. The argument over 3 words became a permanent symbol of everything beneath them. Edward wanted recognition that his sacrifice had been noble. The royal family wanted recognition that his sacrifice had been voluntary. Lascelles trusted neither the romance nor the grievance. He had watched Edward turn every consequence into proof that others had mistreated him. The Duke now spoke as though the family had driven him from Britain, denied his wife, reduced his income, and refused reconciliation. He rarely spoke with equal force about what Bertie had inherited. The new king inherited official papers, state ceremonies, military responsibilities, political audiences, and the expectation that he should restore confidence immediately. He also inherited Sandringham and Balmoral, only after arranging payment to Edward. Money moved between the brothers while affection drained away. Edward claimed that his private finances had been misunderstood and that he needed a proper allowance. The palace worried that he was concealing the full extent of his assets. The discussions became suspicious and humiliating. George believed he was supporting a brother in exile. Edward believed the support was inadequate and conditional. Both men felt cheated. Only one had kept the job. The Duke and Duchess then made a decision that confirmed Lascelles' darkest judgment of Edward's political instincts. In October 1937, they travelled to Germany. Adolf Hitler had been in power for more than 4 years. Political opponents had been imprisoned. Jewish citizens had been stripped of rights. Books had been burned. Rearmament was open. Nazi propaganda had transformed dictatorship into spectacle through uniforms, banners, mass rallies, and carefully arranged displays of national revival. Edward believed he could observe conditions for himself. He had long been interested in Germany and deeply anxious to prevent another European war. He also wanted a public role. Britain had denied Wallace royal status, but foreign governments could still receive them as figures of enormous importance. Nazi Germany was delighted to do so. The Duke and Duchess toured factories, training centres, housing projects and social institutions selected by the regime. They were shown order, employment, discipline and modern development. The uglier machinery of dictatorship was kept beyond the route. Edward met senior Nazi officials. He inspected troops. He returned salutes. Photographs showed him amid symbols of a regime already preparing Europe for catastrophe. Then he met Hitler at the Berghof. The meeting gave Hitler exactly what he wanted. A former British king had entered his home and treated him as a statesman worthy of direct personal engagement. Edward may have believed conversation could support peace. Hitler understood that photographs could support legitimacy. Lascelles saw the old pattern on a far more dangerous scale. Edward trusted personal contact. He believed he could judge men by meeting them. He disliked professional diplomats because they complicated impressions with reports, warnings, and history. He had made the same mistake with crowds. If people smiled, he believed harmony existed. The Nazis had built an entire government around arranging what visitors saw. Edward had spent his life being protected from unpleasant realities. In Germany, a dictatorship used that weakness as hospitality. The visit appalled much of the British establishment. It also strengthened suspicions that the Duke could not be trusted near sensitive affairs. He was no longer sovereign, but his name still carried royal authority. Anything he said could be interpreted as a message from Britain. George VI had to live with the embarrassment while preparing for a European crisis he had not created. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria. Later that year, Britain and France accepted the transfer of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia to Germany in the hope of avoiding war. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich claiming peace. Edward approved strongly of efforts to prevent conflict. So did millions who remembered the First World War. Wanting peace was not the shame. The danger was refusing to recognize the price Hitler intended others to pay for it. In March 1939, German forces occupied the rest of the Czech lands. The promise made at Munich was exposed. In September, Germany invaded Poland. Britain declared war. George VI now faced the burden Edward had once been expected to carry. He had to speak to the nation, support the government, visit troops, endure bombing, comfort families, and become the steady public centre of a country whose survival was uncertain. The king feared the broadcast announcing war. His stammer made every microphone a judgment. But he worked with Lionel Logue, the Australian speech therapist who had helped him for years. Elizabeth sat near him. The words came slowly, honestly, and with visible effort. That effort became strength. Edward had made public speaking look easy. George made courage audible. Lascelles watched the king grow into the role through fear rather than freedom from it. Bertie did not enjoy the burden. He carried it because others depended upon him. This was the character Lascelles had searched for in Edward and never found. The royal family remained in Britain during the war. George and Elizabeth visited bombed neighbourhoods, factories, hospitals and military units. Buckingham Palace was bombed. The Queen remarked that she could now look the East End in the face. The comment endured because it joined privilege to shared danger. The King and Queen had not suffered as ordinary families suffered. They had protection, staff, food and country houses. But they remained visible in the same threatened country. They did not move their duty somewhere more comfortable. The Duke of Windsor was serving in France as a military liaison when the German attack began in May 1940. As France collapsed, he travelled south and eventually reached Spain and Portugal. His presence created a security problem. German officials believed Edward might be useful. Some imagined that if Britain were defeated or forced into negotiation, the former king could become the centre of a government more willing to make peace. Whether Edward would ever have accepted such a role remains disputed, but the fact that Nazi planners considered him suitable was alarming enough. British intelligence watched his contacts. Officials worried about careless conversation. The Duke was bitter toward the royal family and government, frustrated by his lack of employment, and still convinced that he understood Germany better than many of the people responsible for fighting it. Lascelles did not need proof of treason to distrust him. Carelessness in a former king could be dangerous without becoming treason. Edward wanted a meaningful wartime position. The government wanted him far from Europe. He was appointed governor of the Bahamas. The post gave him an official role and removed him from the centre of war. To Edward, it felt like exile disguised as service. The Bahamas were beautiful, but Nassau was small, colonial, and distant from the capitals where important decisions were made. He believed his abilities were being wasted. The local population included wealthy white residents, British officials, poor black labourers, merchants, hotel workers, and migrants. Tourism had brought money, but wealth was distributed sharply. Wartime shortages increased tension. Edward could show energy when the work interested him. He supported some housing improvements, encouraged employment projects, and brought attention to local conditions. Wallace organised social life and charitable activity. Yet their household also became associated with status, expense, and dissatisfaction. The Duke complained about the posting. He disliked the climate at times, resented officials, and continued to feel underused. His language about local people could be prejudiced and dismissive, reflecting both his class and an imperial outlook that treated entire populations as subjects to be judged rather than citizens to be heard. In June 1942, labour unrest erupted in Nassau. Workers protested wages and conditions connected with a construction project. Violence followed. People were killed and injured. Edward responded as governor. But his interpretation of the unrest revealed the limits of his famous sympathy. He had once moved British miners by declaring that something must be done. In the Bahamas, when poor black workers challenged an unequal system under his own authority, he was more inclined to see disorder, agitation, and outside influence. Compassion had always come most easily when Edward could visit suffering and then leave. Government required him to remain after the crowd stopped cheering. The war years destroyed the image of him as the indispensable prince Britain had lost. George VI, once considered weak, became a symbol of steadiness. Edward, once considered modern, looked increasingly trapped inside the grievances of 1936. The contrast was severe because it was fair. George did not suddenly become brilliant at everything. He remained anxious and sometimes irritable. He depended greatly on Elizabeth. His health suffered under work and smoking. But he read papers, accepted constitutional limits, and placed the institution before his comfort. Lascelles served him throughout the war, becoming the king's private secretary in 1943. The position placed him at the centre of royal and governmental communication. He dealt with ministers, military matters, appointments, speeches, tours, family difficulties, and the daily pressure of maintaining public confidence. He had once managed a prince who made duty more difficult for everyone around him. He now served a king whose sense of duty made everyone around him more determined. Lascelles could still be sharp, impatient, and convinced of his own correctness. He was not transformed into a gentle grandfather by constitutional satisfaction. Ministers and courtiers sometimes found him formidable, but his severity now protected a sovereign willing to listen. The relationship worked because George did not demand affection as payment for ignoring advice. After victory in Europe in May 1945, the royal family appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace with Winston Churchill. Crowds filled the mall. Princess Elizabeth, now 19, wore uniform as a member of the Auxiliary Territorial Service. Her younger sister Margaret stood beside her. The two girls had grown up during the reign Edward had abandoned. Elizabeth had watched her father become king unwillingly and serve faithfully. She had seen her mother turn private loyalty into public strength. She had learned that the crown was not a prize given to the eldest person. It was a claim made upon a life. Lascelles would later serve her too. Edward and Wallis returned to France after the war. They settled in a house near Paris, provided through an arrangement with the French authorities. Their life included servants, parties, travel, fashionable clothes, wealthy friends, and repeated negotiations over status and money. They achieved the freedom Edward had wanted, but freedom did not provide purpose. He continued seeking recognition from the family. He wanted Wallis received properly. He wanted invitations, ceremonial roles, and signs that the past had been forgiven. Yet he did not express sustained understanding of why forgiveness was difficult. The Duke often treated his exclusion as an act performed against him rather than the result of an act performed by him. Lascelles resisted efforts that might allow Edward to appear as an alternative royal centre. He believed the Duke could be charming, persuasive, and profoundly irresponsible. Time had not disproved his judgment. It had enlarged the evidence. The royal family occasionally met Edward at funerals and other unavoidable moments. Courtesy survived. Intimacy did not. Queen Mary never fully recovered from the abdication. She maintained contact with her eldest son, but her letters carried the discipline of a mother who would not allow love to rewrite principle. When she died in March 1953, Edward returned for the funeral. By then, George VI was also dead. The king's health had declined after the war. Years of strain and heavy smoking damaged his lungs and arteries. He underwent surgery in 1951. Princess Elizabeth increasingly carried out duties on his behalf. On February 6, 1952, George died at Sandringham at the age of 56. Elizabeth was in Kenya when she became queen. Lascelles remained private secretary during the transition. Once again he watched the crown pass through death into an unprepared life. But this time, the new sovereign had been prepared in character, even if the moment came early. Elizabeth was 25, married to Philip, and the mother of 2 young children. She had already declared that her whole life would be devoted to service. The promise was not a romantic sentence created during crisis. She would spend decades proving that she meant it. Lascelles helped guide the opening of her reign. He brought memory, rules, and a suspicion of personal improvisation sharpened by everything he had witnessed under Edward. He understood that a young monarch required protection from courtiers who agreed too quickly and relatives who confused access with authority. The new queen respected experience. She read papers, asked questions, and accepted that the crown imposed limits upon the person wearing it. She could be private, stubborn, and cautious, but she did not describe duty as something stolen from her by lesser minds. For Lascelles, the difference was almost a moral vindication. He retired in 1953 after serving 4 sovereigns and surviving the royal crisis that had confirmed his worst fears. He received honours, titles, and the formal gratitude of an institution he had spent much of his life defending from one of its own heirs. His private writings were far less polished than palace announcements. He recorded judgments, irritation, political impressions, and sharp observations about the people around the crown. He was not neutral about Edward. He could not be. He had known him before Wallace, before the throne, and before abdication turned a long failure of character into a famous love story. He had watched the pattern begin when Edward was still a young prince surrounded by applause. The pattern was simple. Edward wanted affection without correction. He wanted privilege without restraint. He wanted public duty to pause whenever private feeling became intense. He wanted advisers to tell the truth only when the truth agreed with him. He wanted the crown to confirm his identity, not govern his conduct. Wallace did not create these desires. She became the final test of them. This is why Lascelles never trusted Edward. Not because the prince lacked kindness. He had kindness. Not because he lacked courage. He could be physically brave. Not because he lacked intelligence. He often understood people faster than the officials around him. Lascelles distrusted him because the best parts of Edward were not reliable. His compassion depended on proximity. His discipline depended on interest. His loyalty depended on emotional satisfaction. His self-knowledge did not lead to self-control. A constitutional king could not be excellent only when inspired. The crown required steadiness during boredom, restraint during anger, patience during loneliness, and sacrifice when no one applauded. Edward had spent years showing Lascelles that he considered these demands unreasonable. When the final choice came, he proved that they were beyond him. The abdication is still remembered as a great romance, because romance gives the story a shape people understand. A king loved a woman. The world said no. He surrendered the throne, but Lascelles had seen the less beautiful story underneath. A household had protected a prince from consequences until he believed consequences were persecution. A family had excused his restlessness until restlessness became identity. A nation had adored his charm until he mistook adoration for permission. Then a shy brother, a determined wife, and a 10-year-old girl were required to carry what he dropped. Edward gained Wallace and lost the crown. George gained the crown and lost the quiet life he had built. Elizabeth inherited a future she had not expected. Lascelles inherited the knowledge that he had been right years before anyone wished to hear it. He did not hate Edward because Edward was weak. He feared him because weakness, when surrounded by rank, beauty, money, obedience, and applause, could look exactly like destiny.